Chapter 20 of Historical Tales, Volume 2, American 2. Historical Tales, Volume 2, American 2, by Charles Morris. Chapter 20 How Old Hickory Fought the Creeks. Shall we seek to picture to our readers a scene in the streets of Nashville, Tennessee, less than a century ago, though it seems to belong to the days of barbarism? Two groups of men, made up of the most respectable citizens of the place, stood furiously shooting at each other with pistols and guns, as if this was their idea of after-dinner recreation. Their leaders were Colonel Thomas Benton II, afterward famous in the United States Senate, and General Andrew Jackson, famous in a dozen ways. The men of the frontier in those days were hot in temper and quick in action, and family feuds led quickly to wounds and death, as they still do in the mountains of East Tennessee. Some trifling quarrel, that may perhaps have been settled by 5 minutes of common-sense arbitration, led to this fierce fray, in the midst of which Jesse Benton, brother of the colonel, fired at Jackson with a huge pistol, loaded to the muzzle with bullets and slugs. It was like a charge of grape-shot. A slug from it shattered Jackson's left shoulder, a ball sank to the bone in his left arm, and another splintered a board by his aid. When the fight ended, Jackson was found insensible in the entry of a tavern, with the blood pouring profusely from his wounds. He was carried in, and all the doctors of the town were summoned, but before the bleeding could be stopped, 2 mattresses were soaked through with blood. The doctors said the arm was so badly injured that it must be taken off at once, but when Old Hickory set his lips in his grim way and said, "I'll keep my arm," the question was settled. No one dare touch that arm. For weeks afterward Jackson lay a helpless invalid, while his terrible wounds slowly healed. And while he lay there a dreadful event took place in the territory to the south, which called for the presence of men like Old Hickory, sound of limb and in full strength. This was the frightful Indian massacre at Fort Mims, one of the worst in all our history. It was now the autumn of the year 1813, the second year of the war with England. Tecumseh, the famous Indian warrior and orator, had stirred up the savages of the South to take the British side in the war, and for fear of an Indian rising the settlers around Fort Mims in southern Alabama had crowded into the fort, which was only a rude log stockade. On the morning of August 30th, more than 550 souls, 100 of them being women and children, were crowded within that contracted space. On the evening of that day 400 of them, including all the women and children, lay bleeding on the ground, scalped and shockingly mangled. 1,000 Creek Indians had broken into the carelessly guarded fort, and perpetrated one of the most horrid massacres in the history of Indian wars. Weathersford, the leader of the Indians, tried to stop the ferocious warriors in their dreadful work, but they surrounded him and threatened him with their tomahawks while they glutted to the full their thirst for blood. Many days passed before the news of this frightful affair in the southern wilderness reached Nashville. The excitement it created was intense. The savages were in arms and had tasted blood. The settlements everywhere were in peril. The country might be ravaged from the Ohio to the Gulf. It was agreed by all that there was only one thing to do. The Indians must be put down. But the man best fitted to do it, the man who was depended upon in every emergency, lay half dead in his room, slowly recovering from his dreadful wound. A year before, Jackson had led 2,000 men to Natchez to defend New Orleans in case the British should come, and had been made by the government a major general of volunteers. He was the man everyone wanted now, but to get him seemed impossible, and the best that could be done was to get his advice. So a committee was appointed to visit and confer with the wounded hero. When the members of the committee called on the war horse of the West, they found him still within the shadow of death, his wounds sore and festering, his frame so weak that he could barely raise his head from the pillow. But when they told him of the massacre and the revengeful feeling of the people, the news almost lifted him from his bed. It seemed to send new life coursing through his veins. His voice, though weakened by illness, yet with its old ring of decision, was raised for quick and stern action against the savage foes who had so long menaced Tennessee. And if they wanted a leader, he was the man. When the committee reported the next day, they said there was no doubt that our brave and patriotic General Jackson would be ready to lead the men of war by the time they were ready to march. Where Jackson led, there would be plenty to follow. 4,000 men were called out, with orders to assemble at Fayetteville, 80 miles south of Nashville, on October 4th, just 1 month from the day when Jackson had received his wounds. From his bed he took command. By his orders, Colonel Coffee rode to Huntsville, Alabama, with 500 men. As he advanced, volunteers came riding in armed and equipped, till he was at the head of 1,300 men. On the 7th of October, Jackson himself reached the rendezvous. He was still a mere wreck, thin as a shadow, tottering with weakness, and needing to be lifted bodily to his horse. His arm was closely bound and in a sling. His wounds were so sensitive that the least jar or wrench gave him agony. His stomach was in such a state that he was in danger of dying from starvation. Several times during his first 2 days' ride he had to be sponged from head to foot with whiskey. Yet his dauntless spirit kept him up, and he bore the dreadful ride of 80 miles with a fortitude rarely equalled. So resolute was he that he reached Fayetteville before half the men had gathered. He was glad there to receive news that the Creeks were advancing northward towards Tennessee. "Give them my thanks for saving me the pain of travelling," he said. "I must not be outdone in politeness, and will try to meet them half-way." On the 11th a new advance was made to Huntsville, the troops riding 6 miles an hour for 5 hours, a remarkable feat for a man in Jackson's condition. Many a twinge of bitter pain he had on that march, but his spirit was past yielding. At this point Colonel Coffee was joined, and the troops encamped on a bend of the Tennessee River. A false alarm of the advance of the Indians had caused this hasty march. Jackson and his men, 2,500 in number, with 1,300 horses, now found themselves threatened by a foe more terrible than the Indians they had come to meet. They were in the heart of the wilderness of Alabama, far away from any full supply of food. Jackson thus described this foe in a letter written by his secretary: "There is an enemy whom I dread much more than I do the hostile Creeks. I mean the meagre monster Famine. I shall leave this encampment in the morning, direct for the 10 Islands, and yet I have not on hand 2 days' supply of breadstuffs." 1,000 barrels of flour and a proportionate supply of meat had been purchased for him a week before, but the Tennessee River was low, the flatboats would not float, and the much-needed food lay in the shallows 300 miles upstream. There was nothing to do but to live on the country, and this Colonel Coffee had swept almost clear of provisions on his advanced movement. Under such circumstances Jackson ran a great risk in marching farther into the Indian country. Yet the exigency was one in which boldness seemed necessary. A reverse movement might have brought the Indians in force on the settlers of Tennessee, with sanguinary results. Keeping his foragers busy in search of food, he moved steadily southward till the Coosa River was reached. Here came the first encounter with the savages. There was a large body of them at Tallishatchis, 13 miles away. At daybreak on the morning after the Coosa was reached, the Indian camp was encircled by Colonel Coffee with 1,000 men. The savages, taken by surprise, fought fiercely and desperately, and fell where they stood, fighting while a warrior remained alive. All the prisoners were women and children, who were taken to the settlements and kindly treated. Jackson himself brought up one of the boys in his own family. 4 days afterward, news came that a body of friendly Creeks, 150 in number, were at Talladega, 30 miles away, surrounded by 1,000 hostile Indians, cut off from their water supply, and in imminent danger of annihilation. A wily chief had dressed himself in the skin of a large hog, and in this disguise passed unsuspected through the hostile lines, bringing his story to Jackson 24 hours later. At that moment the little army had only 1 day's supply of food, but its general did not hesitate. Advancing with all the men fit to move, they came within hearing of the yelling enemy and quickly closed in upon them. When that brief battle ended, 200 of the Indian braves lay dead on the field, and Colonel Coffee with his horsemen was in hot pursuit of the remainder. As for the rescued Indians, their joy was beyond measure, for they had looked only for death. They gathered around their preserver, expressing their gratitude by joyful cries and gestures, and gladly gave what little corn they had left to feed the hungry soldiers. The loss of the whites in this raid was 15 men killed and 86 wounded. The badly wounded were carried in litters back to Fort Strother, where the sick had been left, and where Jackson now fully expected to find a full supply of food. To his acute disappointment not an ounce had arrived, little in the shape of food being left but a few half-starved cattle. For several days Jackson and his staff ate nothing but tripe without seasoning. And now for 10 long weeks came that dread contest he had feared, the battle with famine. With a good supply of provisions he could have ended the war in a fortnight. As it was, the men had simply to wait and forage, being at times almost in a starving state. The brave borderers found it far harder to sit and starve than it would have been to fight, and discontent in the camp rose to the height of mutiny, which it took all the general's tact and firmness to overcome. Part of his men were militia, part of them volunteers, and between these there was a degree of jealousy. On one occasion the militia resolved to start for home, but when they set out in the early morning they found the volunteers drawn up across the road, with their grim general at their head. When they saw Jackson, they turned and marched back to their quarters again. Soon afterward the volunteers were infected with the same fancy. But again Jackson was aware of their purpose, and when they marched from their quarters they found their way blocked by militia, with Jackson at their head. The tables had been turned on them. As time went on and hunger grew more relentless, the spirit of discontent infected the entire force, and it took all the general's power to keep them in the camp. On one occasion a large body of the men seized their arms, and swearing that they would not stay there to be starved, got ready to march home. General Jackson, hot with wrath, seized a musket, and planting himself before them, swore by the Eternal that he would shoot the first man that set a foot forward. His countenance was appalling in its concentrated rage, his eyes blazed with a terrible fire, and the mutineers, confronted by this apparition of fury, hesitated, drew back, and retired to their tents. But the time came at length in which nothing would hold them back. Persuasion and threats were alike useless. The general used entreaties and promises, saying, "I have advices that supply wagons are on the way, and that there is a large drove of cattle near at hand. Wait 2 days more, and if then they do not come, we will all march home together." The 2 days passed, and the food did not arrive. Much against his will, he was obliged to keep his word. "If only 2 men will stay with me," he cried, "I will never give up the post." 109 men agreed to remain, and leaving these in charge of the fort, Jackson set out at the head of the others with their promise that when they procured supplies and satisfied their hunger, they would return to the fort and march upon the foe. The next day the expected provision train was met, and the hungry men were well fed. But home was in their minds, and it took all the general's indomitable will and fierce energy to induce them to turn back, and they did so in sullen discontent. In the end it was necessary to exchange these men for fresh volunteers. When the dissatisfied men got home they told such doleful tales of their hardships and sufferings that the people were filled with dismay. Volunteering came to an end, and even the governor wrote to Jackson, advising him to give up the expedition as hopeless and return home. Had not Andrew Jackson been 1 man in a million, he would not have hesitated to obey. A well man might justly have despaired, but to a physical wreck, his shoulder still painful, his left arm useless, suffering from insufficient food, from acute dyspepsia, from chronic diarrhoea, from cramps of terrible severity, to a man in this condition, who should have been in bed under a physician's care, to remain seemed utter madness, and yet he remained. His indomitable spirit triumphed over his enfeebled body. He had set out to subdue the hostile Indians and save the settlements from their murderous raids, and by the Eternal he would. He wrote a letter to Governor Blunt, eloquent, logical, appealing, resolute, and so convincing in its arguments that the governor changed his sentiment. The people became enthusiastic, volunteers came forward freely, and the most earnest exertions were made to collect and forward supplies. But this was not till the spring of 1814, and the lack of supplies continued the winter through. Only 900 discontented troops remained, but with these he won 2 victories over the Indians, in one of which an utter panic was averted only by his courage and decision in the hour of peril. At length fresh troops began to arrive. A regiment of United States soldiers, 600 strong, reached him on February 6th. By the 1st of March there were 6,000 troops near Fort Strother, and only the arrival of a good food supply was awaited to make a finishing move. Food came slowly, despite all exertions. Over the miry roads the wagon teams could hardly be moved with light loads. Only absolutely necessary food was brought, even whiskey, considered indispensable in those days, being barred out. All sick and disabled men were sent home, and the non-combatants weeded out so thoroughly that only one man was left in camp who could beat the ordinary calls on the drum. At length, about the middle of March, a sufficient supply of food was at hand, and the final advance began. Meanwhile the hostile Creeks had made themselves a stronghold at a place 55 miles to the south. Here was a bend of Tallapoosa River, called, from its shape, Tohopeka, or Horseshoe. It was a well-wooded area, about 100 acres in extent, across whose neck the Indians had built a strong breastwork of logs, with 2 rows of portholes, the whole so well constructed that it was evident they had been aided by British soldiers in its erection. At the bottom of the bend was a village of wigwams, and there were many canoes in the stream. Within this stronghold was gathered the fighting force of the tribe, nearly 1,000 warriors, and in the wigwams were about 300 women and children. It was evident that they intended to make here their final desperate stand. The force led against them was 2,000 strong. Their route of travel lay through the unbroken forest wilds, and it took 11 days to reach the Indian fort. A glance at it showed Jackson the weakness of the savage engineering. As he said, they had penned themselves in for destruction. The work began by sending Colonel Coffee across the river, with orders to post his men opposite the line of canoes and prevent the Indians from escaping. Coffee did more than this. He sent swimmers over who cut loose the canoes and brought them across the stream. With their aid he sent troops over the bend to attack the savages in the rear, while Jackson assailed them in the front. The battle began with a fierce assault, but soon settled down to a slow slaughter, which lasted for 5 or 6 hours, the fierce warriors, as in the former battles, refusing to ask for quarter or to accept their lives. Their prophets had told them that if they did, they would be put to death by torture. When the battle ended, few of them were left alive. On the side of the whites only 55 were killed, and about 3 times as many wounded. This signal defeat ended forever the power of the Creek nation, once the leading Indian power of the Gulf region. Such of the chiefs as survived surrendered. Among them was Weathersford, their valiant half-breed leader. Mounted on his well-known grey horse, famed for its speed and endurance, he rode to the door of Jackson's tent. The old soldier looked up to see before him this famous warrior, tall, erect, majestic, and dignified. "I am Weathersford," he said. "Late your enemy, now your captive." From without the tent came fierce cries of "Kill him! Kill him!" "You may kill me if you wish," said the proud chief, "but I came to tell you that our women and children are starving in the woods. They never did you any harm, and I came to beg you to send them food." Jackson looked sternly at the angry throng outside, and said in his vigorous way, "Any man who would kill as brave a man as this would rob the dead." He then invited the chief into his tent, where he promised him the aid he asked for and freedom for himself. "I do not war with women and children," he said. So corn was sent to the suffering women, and Weathersford was allowed to mount his good grey steed and ride away as he had come. He induced the remaining Creeks to accept the terms offered by the victorious general, these being peace and protection, with the provision that half their lands should be ceded to the United States. As may well be imagined, a triumphant reception was given Jackson and his men on their return to Nashville. Shortly afterward came the news that he had been appointed Major General in the Army of the United States, to succeed William Henry Harrison, resigned. He had made his mark well against the Indians. He was soon to make it as well against the British at New Orleans. End of chapter 20.
Chapter 21 of Historical Tales, Volume 2, American 2. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Historical Tales, Volume 2, American 2, by Charles Morris. Chapter 21. The Pirates of Barataria Bay. On the coast of Louisiana, westward from the delta of the Mississippi, there lies a strange country, in which sea and land seem struggling for dominion, neither being victor in the endless contest. It is a low, flat, moist land, where countless watercourses intertwine into a complex network, while nearer the sea are a multitude of bays stretching far inland, and largely shut off from the salt sea waves by barriers of long, narrow islands. Some of these islands are low stretches of white sand, flung up by the restless waters which ever wash to and fro. Others are of rich earth, brought down by lazy waterways from the fertile north, and deposited at the river outlets. Tall marsh grasses grow profusely here, and hide alike water and land. Everywhere are slow-moving, half-sleeping bayous, winding and twisting interminably, and encircling multitudes of islands which lie hidden behind a dense growth of rushes and reeds 12 feet high. It was through this region, neither water nor land, that the hapless Evangeline, the heroine of Longfellow's famous poem, was rowed, seeking her lover in these flooded wilds, and not dreaming that he lay behind one of those reedy barrens, almost within touch, yet as unseen as if leagues of land separated them. One of the bays of this liquid coast, some 60 miles south of New Orleans, is a large sheet of water, with a narrow island partly shutting it off from the Gulf. This is known as Grande Terre, and west of it is another island known as Grande Île. Between these two long land gates is a broad, deep channel which serves as entrance to the bay. On the western side lies a host of smaller islands, the passes between them made by the bayous which straggle down through the land. Northward, the bay stretches 16 miles inland, and then breaks up into a medley of bayous and small lakes, cutting far into the land, and yielding an easy passage to the level of the Mississippi opposite New Orleans. Such is Barataria Bay, once the famous haunt of the buccaneers. It seems made by nature as a lurking place for smugglers and pirates, and that is the purpose to which it was long devoted. The passages inland served admirably for the disposal of ill-gotten goods. For years the pirates of Barataria Bay defied the authorities, making the Gulf the scene of their exploits, and finding a secret and ready market for their wares in New Orleans. The pirate leaders were two daring Frenchmen, Pierre and Jean Lafitte, who came from Bordeaux some time after 1800 and settled in New Orleans. They were educated men, who had seen much of the world, and spoke several languages fluently. Pierre, having served in the French army, became a skilled fencing master. Jean set up a blacksmith shop, his slaves doing the work. Such was the creditable way in which these worthies began their New World career. Their occupation changed in 1808, in which year the slave trade was brought to an end by act of Congress. There was also passed an Embargo Act, which forbade trade with foreign countries. Here was a double opportunity for men who placed gain above law. The Lafittes at once took advantage of it, smuggling negroes and British goods, bringing their illicit wares inland by way of the bayous of the coastal plain, and readily disposing of them as honest goods. Not long after this time the British cruisers broke up the pirate hordes which had long infested the West Indies. Their haunts were taken, and they had to flee. Some of them became smugglers, landing their goods on Amelia Island on the coast of Florida. Others sought the bays of Louisiana, where they kept up their old trade. The Lafittes now found it to their advantage to handle the goods of these buccaneers, in which they posed as honest merchants. Later on they made piracy their trade, the whole fleet of the rovers coming under their control. Throwing off the cloak of honesty, they openly defied the laws. Prize goods and negroes were introduced into New Orleans with little effort at secrecy, and were sold in disregard of the law and the customs. It was well known that the Baratarian rovers were pirates, but the weak efforts to dislodge them failed, and the government was openly despised. Making Barataria Bay their headquarters and harbour of refuge, the pirates fortified Grande Terre, and built on it their dwellings and storehouses. On Grande Île farms were cultivated and orange groves planted. On another island, named the Temple, they held auctions for the sale of their plunder, the purchasers smuggling it up the bayous and introducing it under cover of night into New Orleans, where there was nothing to show its source, though suspicion was rife. Such was Barataria until the war with England began, and such it continued through this war till 1814, the Lafittes and their pirate followers flourishing in their desperate trade. We might go on to tell a gruesome story of fearful deeds by these bandits of the sea, of vessels plundered and scuttled, and sailors made to walk the plank of death. a rich spoil won by ruthless murder and wild orgies on the shores of Grande Terre. But of all this there is little record, and the lives of these pirates yield us none of the scenes of picturesque wickedness and wholesale murder which embellish the stories of Blackbeard, Morgan, and other sea rovers of old. Yet the career of the Laffittes has an historical interest which makes it worth the telling. It was not until 1814, during the height of the war with England, that the easy-going Creoles of New Orleans grew indignant enough at the bold defiance of law by the Laffittes to make a vigorous effort to stop it. It was high time, for the buccaneers had grown so bold as to fire on the revenue officers of the government. Determined to bear this disgrace no longer, Pierre Lafitte was seized in the streets of New Orleans, and with one of his captains, named Dominique Yon, was locked up in the Calabooza. This step was followed by a proclamation from Governor Claiborne offering $500 for the arrest of Jean Lafitte, the acting pirate chief. Lafitte insolently retorted by offering $5,000 for the head of the governor. This impudent defiance aroused Claiborne to more decisive action. A force of militia was called out, and sent overland to Barataria, with orders to capture and destroy the settlement of the buccaneers, and seize all the pirates they could lay hands on. The governor did not know the men with whom he had to deal. Their spies kept him fully informed of all his movements. Southward trudged the citizen soldiers, tracking their oozy way through the water-soaked land. All was silent and seemingly deserted. They were near their goal, and not a man had been seen. But suddenly a boatswain's whistle sounded, and from a dozen secret passages armed men swarmed out upon them, and in a few minutes had them surrounded and under their guns. Resistance was hopeless, and they were obliged to surrender at discretion. The grim pirates stood ready to slaughter them all if a hand were raised in self-defence, and Lafitte, stepping forward, invited them to join his men, promising them an easy life and excellent pay. Their captain sturdily refused. "Very well," said Lafitte, with disdainful generosity, "you can go or stay as you please. Yonder is the road you came by. You are free to follow it back, but if you are wise, you will in future keep out of reach of the jolly rovers of the Gulf." We are not sure if these were Lafitte's exact words, but at any rate the captain and his men were set free, and trudged back again, glad enough to get off with whole skins. Soon after that, the war, which had lingered so long in the north, showed signs of making its way to the south. A British fleet appeared in the Gulf in the early autumn of 1814, and made an attack on Mobile. In September, a war vessel from this fleet appeared off Barataria Bay, fired on one of the pirate craft, and dropped anchor some 6 miles out. Soon a pinnace, bearing a white flag, put off from its side, and was rowed shoreward. It was met by a vessel which had put off from Grande Terre. "I am Captain Lockyer of the Sophia," said the British officer. "I wish to see Captain Lafitte." "I am he," came a voice from the pirate bark. "Then this is for you," and Captain Lockyer handed Lafitte a bulky package. "Will you come ashore while I examine this?" asked Lafitte courteously. "I offer you such humble entertainment as we poor mariners can afford." "I shall be glad to be your guest," answered the officer. Lafitte now led the way ashore, welcomed the visitors to his island domain, and proceeded to open and examine the package brought him. It contained 4 documents, their general purport being to threaten the pirates with utter destruction if they continued to prey on the commerce of England and Spain, and to offer Lafitte, if he would aid the British cause, the rank of captain in the service of Great Britain, with a large sum of money, and full protection for person and property. The letters read, Lafitte left the room, saying that he wished time to consider before he could answer. But hardly had he gone when some of his men rushed in, seized Captain Lockyer and his men, and locked them up as prisoners. They were held captive all night, doubtless in deep anxiety, for pirates are scarcely safe hosts. But in the morning Lafitte appeared with profuse apologies, declaring loudly that his men had acted without his knowledge or consent, and leading the way to their boat. Lockyer was likely glad enough to find himself on the Gulf waters again, despite the pirates' excuses. 2 hours later, Lafitte sent him word that he would accept his offer, but that he must have 2 weeks to get his affairs in order. With this answer, the Sophia lifted anchor, spread sails, and glided away. All this was a bit of diplomatic by-play on the part of Jean Lafitte. He had no notion of joining the British cause. The Sophia had not long disappeared when he sent the papers to New Orleans, asking only one favor in return, the release of his brother Pierre. This the authorities seemed to have granted in their own way, for in the next morning's papers was an offer of $1,000 reward for the capture of Pierre Lafitte, who had, probably with their connivance, broken jail during the night. Jean Lafitte now offered Governor Claiborne his services in the war with the British. He was no pirate, he said. That was a base libel. His ships were legitimate privateers, bearing letters of marque from Venezuela in the war of that country with Spain. He was ready and anxious to transfer his allegiance to the United States. His sudden change of tone had its sufficient reason. It is probable that Lafitte was well aware of a serious danger just then impending, far more threatening than the militia raid which had been so easily defeated. A naval expedition was ready to set out against him. It consisted of 3 barges of troops under Commander Patterson of the American Navy. These were joined at the Balize by 6 gunboats and a schooner, and proceeded against the piratical stronghold. On the 16th of September the small fleet came within sight of Grande Terre, drew up in line of battle, and started for the entrance to Barataria Bay. Within this the pirate fleet, 10 vessels in all, was in line to receive them. Soon there was trouble for the assailants. Shoal water stopped the schooner, and the 2 larger gunboats ran aground. But their men swarmed into boats and rowed on in the wake of the other vessels, which quickly made their way through the pass, and began a vigorous attack on its defenders. Now the war was all afoot, and we should be glad to tell of a gallant and nobly contested battle, in which the sea rovers showed desperate courage and reddened the sea with their blood. There might be inserted here a battle piece worthy of the Drakes and Morgans of old, if the facts only bore us out. Instead of that, however, we are forced to say that the pirates proved sheer caitiffs when matched against honest men, and the battle was a barren farce. Commander Patterson and his men dashed bravely on, and in a very short time 2 of the pirate vessels were briskly burning, a 3rd had run aground, and the others were captured. Many of the pirates had fled, the others were taken. The battle over, the buildings on Grande Terre and Grande Isle were destroyed, and the piratical lurking-place utterly broken up. This done, the fleet sailed in triumph for New Orleans, bringing with them the captured craft and the prisoners who had been taken. But among the captives was neither of the Lafittes. They had not stood to their guns, but had escaped with the other fugitives into the secret places of the bay. Thus ends the history of Barataria Bay as a haunt of pirates. Since that day, only honest craft have entered its sheltered waters. But the Lafittes were not yet at the end of their career, or at least one of them, for of Pierre Lafitte we hear very little after this time. 2 months after their flight, the famous British assault was made on New Orleans. General Jackson hurried to its defense, and called armed men to his aid from all quarters, caring little who they were, so they were ready to fight. Among those who answered the summons was Jean Lafitte. He called on Old Hickory, and told him that he had a body of trained artillerymen under his command, tried and capable men, and would like to take a hand in defense of the city. Jackson, who had not long before spoken of the Lafittes as hellish banditti, was very glad now to accept their aid. We read of his politely alluding to them as "these gentlemen," and he gave into their charge the siege guns in several of the forts. These guns were skilfully handled and vigorously served, the Baratarians fighting far more bravely in defense of the city than they had done in defense of their ships. They lent important aid in the defeat of Pakenham and his army, and after the battle Jackson commended them warmly for their gallant conduct, praising the Lafittes also for the same courage and fidelity. A few words more and we have done. Of the pirates, 2 only made any future mark. Dominique Yon, the captain who had shared imprisonment with Pierre Lafitte, now settled down to quiet city life, became a leader in ward politics, and grew into something of a local hero, fighting in the precincts instead of on the deck. Jean Lafitte, however, went back to his old trade. From New Orleans he made his way to Texas, then a province of Mexico, and soon we hear of him at his buccaneering work. For a time he figured as governor of Galveston. Then for some years he commanded a fleet that wore the thin guise of Colombian privateers. After that he threw off all disguise and became an open pirate, and as late as 1822 his name was the terror of the Gulf. Soon afterward a fleet of the United States swept those waters and cleared it of all piratical craft. Jean Lafitte then vanished from view, and no one knows whether he died fighting for the black flag or ended his life quietly on land. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of Historical Tales, Volume 2, American 2. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Historical Tales, Volume 2, American 2, by Charles Morris. Chapter 22 The Heroes of the Alamo. On a day in the year 1835, the people of Nacogdoches, Texas, were engaged in the pleasant function of giving a public dinner to one of their leading citizens. In the midst of the festivities, a person entered the room whose appearance was greeted with a salvo of hearty cheers. There seemed nothing in this person's appearance to call forth such a welcome. He was dressed in a half Indian, half hunter's garb. A long-barreled rifle was slanted over his shoulder, and he seemed a favorable specimen of the half-horse, half-alligator type of the early West. But there was a shrewd look on his weather-beaten face, and a humorous twinkle in his eyes that betokened a man above the ordinary frontier level, while it was very evident that the guests present looked upon him as no everyday individual. The visitor was indeed a man of fame, for he was no less a personage than the celebrated Davy Crockett, the hunter-hero of West Tennessee. His fame was due less to his wonderful skill with the rifle than to his genial humor, his endless stories of adventure, his marvelous power of drawing the longbow. Davy had once been sent to Congress, but there he found himself in waters too deep for his footing. The frontier was the place made for him, and when he heard that Texas was in revolt against Mexican rule, he shouldered his famous rifle and set out to take a hand in the game of revolution. It was a question in those days with the reckless borderers whether shooting a Mexican or a coon was the better sport. The festive citizens of Nacogdoches heard that Davy Crockett had arrived in their town on his way to join the Texan army, and at once sent a committee to invite him to join in their feast. Hearty cheers, as we have said, hailed his entrance, and it was not long before he had his worthy hosts in roars of laughter with his quaint frontier stories. He had come to stay with them as a citizen of Texas, he said, and to help them drive out the yellow-legged greasers, and he wanted then and there to take the oath of allegiance to their new republic. If they wanted him to know what claim he had to the honor, he would let old Betsy, his rifle, speak for him. Like George Washington, Betsy never told a lie. The Nacogdochians were not long in making him a citizen, and he soon after set out for the Alamo, the scene of his final exploit and his heroic death. The Alamo was a stronghold in the town of St. Antonio de Béjar, in western Texas. It had been built for a mission house of the early Spaniards, and though its walls were thick and strong, they were only 8 feet high, and were destitute of bastion or redoubt. The place had nothing to make it suitable for warlike use, yet it was to win a great name in the history of Texan independence, a name that spread far beyond the borders of the Lone Star State, and made its story a tradition of American heroism. Soon after the insurrection began, a force of Texans had taken San Antonio, driving out its Mexican garrison. Santa Anna, the President of Mexico, quickly marched north with an army, breathing vengeance against the rebels. This town, which lay well towards the western border, was the first he proposed to take. Under the circumstances, the Texans would have been wise to retreat, for they were few in number, they had little ammunition and provisions, and the town was in no condition for defense. But retreat was far from their thoughts, and when, on an afternoon in February 1836, Santa Anna and his army appeared in the vicinity of San Antonio, the Texans withdrew to the Alamo, the strongest building near the town, prepared to fight to the death. There were less than 200 of them in all, against the thousands of the enemy, but they were men of heroic mould. Colonel Travis, the commander, mounted the walls with 8 pieces of artillery, and did all he could besides to put the place in a state of defense. To show the kind of man Travis was, we cannot do better than to quote his letter asking for aid. Fellow citizens and compatriots, I am besieged by 1,000 or more of the Mexicans under Santa Anna. The enemy have commanded a surrender at discretion; otherwise the garrison is to be put to the sword if the place is taken. I have answered the summons with a cannon shot, and our flag still waves proudly from the walls. I shall never surrender or retreat. Then I call on you in the name of liberty, of patriotism, and of everything dear to the American character, to come to our aid with all despatch. The enemy are receiving reinforcements daily, and will no doubt increase to 3,000 or 4,000 in 4 or 5 days. Though this call may be neglected, I am determined to sustain myself as long as possible, and die like a soldier who never forgets what is due to his own honor, or that of his country. Victory or death. W. Barrett Travis, Lieutenant Colonel Commanding. P.S. The Lord is on our side. When the enemy appeared in sight, we had not 3 bushels of corn. We have since found, in deserted houses, 80 or 90 bushels, and got into the walls 20 or 30 head of beeves. T. The only reinforcements received in response to this appeal were 32 gallant men from Gonzales, who made the whole number 188. Colonel Fannin, at Goliad, sent out with 300 men, but the breaking down of one of his wagons, and a scarcity of supplies, obliged him to return. Among the patriot garrison were Davy Crockett and Colonel James Bowie, the latter as famous a man in his way as the great hunter. He was a duellist of national fame, in those days when the border duels were fought with knife instead of a pistol. He invented the Bowie knife, a terrible weapon in the hands of a resolute man. To be famed as a duellist is no worthy claim to admiration, but to fight hand to hand with knife for weapon is significant of high courage. Small as were their numbers, and slight as were their means of defense, the heroes of the Alamo fought on without flinching. Santa Anna planted his batteries around the stronghold, and kept up a steady bombardment. The Texans made little reply; their store of ammunition was so small that it had to be kept for more critical work. In the town a blood-red banner was displayed in lurid token of the sanguinary purpose of the Mexican leader, but the garrison showed no signs of dismay. They were the descendants of men who had fought against the Indians of the South under like conditions, and they were not likely to forget the traditions of their race. On the 3rd of March a battery was erected within musket shot of the north wall of the fort, on which it poured a destructive fire. Travis now sent out a final appeal for aid, and with it an affecting note to a friend, in which he said: "Take care of my boy. If the country should be saved, I may make him a splendid fortune; but if the country should be lost, and I should perish, he will have nothing but the proud recollection that he is the son of a man who died for his country." The invading force increased in numbers until by the 5th of March there were more than 4,000 of them around the fort, most of them fresh, while the garrison was worn out with incessant toil and witching. The end was near at hand. Soon after midnight on the 6th, the Mexican army gathered close around the fort, prepared for an assault. The infantry carried scaling ladders. Behind them were drawn up the cavalry, with orders to kill any man who might fly from the ranks. This indicated Santa Anna's character and his opinion of men. The men within the walls had no need to be driven to their work. Every one was alert and at his post, and they met with a hot fire from cannon and rifles the Mexican advance. Just as the new day dawned, the ladders were placed against the walls, and the Mexicans scrambled up their rounds. They were driven back with heavy loss. Again the charge for assault was sounded, and a second rush was made for the walls, and once more the bullets of the defenders swept the field, and the assailants fell back in dismay. Santa Anna now went through the beaten ranks with threats and promises, seeking to inspire his men with new courage, and again they rushed forward on all sides of the fort. Many of the Texans had fallen, and all of them were exhausted. It was impossible to defend the whole circle of the walls. The assailants who first reached the tops of the ladders were hurled to the ground, but hundreds rushed in to take their places, and at a dozen points they clambered over the walls. It was no longer possible for the handful of survivors to keep them back. In a few minutes the fort seemed full of assailants. The Texans continued to fight with unflinching courage. When their rifles were emptied, they used them as clubs and struggled on till overwhelmed by numbers. Near the western wall of the fort stood Travis. In the corner near the church stood Crockett, both fighting like Homeric heroes. Old Betsy had done an ample share of work that fatal night. Now, used as a club, it added nobly to its record. The two heroes at length fell, but around each was a heap of slain. Colonel Bowie had taken no part in the fight, having been for some days sick in bed. He was there butchered and mutilated. All others who were unable to fight met the same fate. It had been proposed to blow up the magazine, but Major Evans, the man selected for this duty, was shot as he attempted to perform it. The struggle did not end while a man of the garrison was alive, the only survivors being two Mexican women, Mrs. Dickinson, wife of one of the defenders, and her child, and the negro servant of Colonel Travis. As for the dead Texans, their bodies were brutally mutilated, and then thrown into heaps and burned. Thus fell the Alamo. Thus did the gallant Travis and his men keep their pledge of victory or death. Like the Spartans at Thermopylae, the heroes of the Alamo did not retreat or ask for quarter, but lay where they had stood in obedience to their country's commands. And before and around them lay the bodies of more than 500 of their enemies, with as many wounded. The Texans had not perished unavenged. The sun rose in the skies until it was an hour high. In the fort all was still, but the waters of the aqueduct surrounding resembled in their crimson hue the red flag of death flying in the town. The Alamo was the American Thermopylae. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Historical Tales, Volume 2, American 2. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Historical Tales, Volume 2, American 2, by Charles Morris. Chapter 23. How Houston Won Freedom for Texas. We have told the story of the Alamo. It needs, to complete it, the story of how Travis and his band of heroes were avenged. And this is also the story of how Texas won its independence, and took its place in the colony of nations as the Lone Star Republic. The patriots of Texas had more to avenge than the slaughter at the Alamo. The defenders of Goliad, over 400 in number, under Colonel Fannin, surrendered with a solemn promise of protection from Santa Anna. After the surrender they were divided into several companies, marched in different directions out of the town, and there shot down in cold blood by the Mexican soldiers, not a man of them being left alive. Santa Anna now fancied himself the victor. He had killed 200 men with arms in their hands, and made himself infamous by the massacre of 400 more, and he sent dispatches to Mexico to the effect that he had put down the rebellion and conquered a peace. What he had really done was to fill the Texans with thirst for revenge as well as love of independence. He had dealt with Travis and Fannin. He had Sam Houston still to deal with. General Houston was the leader of the Texan revolt. While these murderous events were taking place, he had only 400 men under his command, and was quite unable to prevent them. Defense now seemed hopeless. The country was in a state of panic. The settlers were abandoning their homes and fleeing as the Mexicans advanced. But Sam Houston kept the field with a spirit like that which had animated the gallant Travis. As the Mexicans advanced, Houston slowly retreated. He was maneuvering for time and place, and seeking to increase his force. Finally, after having brought up his small army to something over 700 men, he took a stand on Buffalo Bayou, a deep, narrow stream flowing into the San Jacinto River, resolved there to strike a blow for Texan independence. It was a forlorn hope, for against him was marshalled the far greater force of the Mexican army. But Houston gave his men a watchword that added to their courage the hot fire of revenge. After making them an eloquent and impassioned address, he fired their souls with the war cry of "Remember the Alamo." Soon after, the Mexican bugles rang out over the prairie, announcing the approach of the vanguard of their army, 1,800 strong. They were well appointed, and made a showy display as they marched across the plain. Houston grimly watched their approach. Turning to his own sparse ranks, he said, Men, there is the enemy. Do you wish to fight?" "We do!" came in a fierce shout. "Well, then, remember it is for liberty or death! Remember the Alamo!" As they stood behind their light breastworks, ready for an attack, if it should be made, a lieutenant came galloping up, his horse covered with foam. As he drew near, he shouted along the lines, "I've cut down Vince's bridge!" This was a bridge which both armies had used in coming to the battlefield. General Houston had ordered its destruction. Its fall left the vanquished in that day's fight without hope of escape. Santa Anna evidently was not ready for an immediate assault. His men halted and entrenched themselves. But Houston did not propose to delay. At 3 in the afternoon, while many of the Mexican officers were enjoying their siesta in perfect confidence, Santa Anna himself being asleep, the word to charge passed from rank to rank along the Texan front, and in a moment the whole line advanced in double quick time, filling the air with vengeful cries of "Remember the Alamo! Remember Goliad!" The Mexican troops sprang to their arms and awaited the attack, reserving their fire until the patriots were within 60 paces. Then they poured forth a volley which, fortunately for the Texans, went over their heads, though a ball struck General Houston's ankle, inflicting a very painful wound. Yet, though bleeding and suffering, the old hero kept to his saddle till the action was at an end. The Texans made no reply to the fire of the foe until within pistol shot, and then poured their leaden hail into the very bosoms of the Mexicans. Hundreds of them fell. There was no time to reload. Having no bayonets, the Texans clubbed their rifles and rushed in fury upon the foe, still rending the air with their wild war cry of "Remember the Alamo!" The Mexicans were utterly unprepared for this furious hand-to-hand assault, and quickly broke before the violent onset. On all sides they gave way. On the left the Texans penetrated the woodland, the Mexicans fled. On the right their cavalry charged that of Santa Anna, which quickly broke and sought safety in flight. In the center they stormed the breastworks, took the enemy's artillery, and drove them back in dismay. In 15 minutes after the charge, the Mexicans were in panic flight, the Texans in mad pursuit. Scarce an hour had passed since the patriots left their works, and the battle was won. Such was the consternation of the Mexicans, so sudden and utter their rout, that their cannon were left loaded and their movables untouched. Those who were asleep awoke only in time to flee. Those who were cooking their dinner left it uneaten. Those who were playing their favorite game of monte left it unfinished. The pursuit was kept up till nightfall, by which time the bulk of the Mexican army were prisoners of war. The victory had been won almost without loss. Only 7 of the Texans were killed and 23 wounded. The Mexican loss was 630, while 730 were made prisoners. But the man they most wanted was still at large. Santa Anna was not among the captives. On the morning of the following day, April 22nd, the Texan cavalry, scouring the country for prisoners, with a sharp eye open for the hated leader of the foe, saw a Mexican whom they loudly bade to surrender. At their demand he fell on the grass and threw a blanket over his head. They had to call on him several times to rise before he slowly dragged himself to his feet. Then he went up to Sylvester, the leader of the party, and kissed his hand, asking if he was General Houston. The man was evidently half beside himself with fright. He was only a private soldier, he declared, but when his captors pointed to the fine studs in the bosom of his shirt, he burst into tears and declared that he was an aide to Santa Anna. The truth came out as the captors brought him back to camp, passing the prisoners, many of whom cried out "El Presidente." It was evidently Santa Anna himself. The President of Mexico was a prisoner, and Texas was free. When the trembling captive was brought before Houston, he said, "General, you can afford to be generous. You have conquered the Napoleon of the West." Had Houston done full justice to this Napoleon of the West, he would have hung him on the spot. As it was, his captors proved generous, and his life was spared. The victory of San Jacinto struck the fetters from the hands of Texas. No further attempt was made to conquer it, and General Houston became the hero and the first president of the new republic. When Texas was made a part of the United States, Houston was one of its first senators, and in later years he served as governor of the state. His splendid victory had made him its favorite son. End of chapter 23.
Chapter 24 of Historical Tales, Volume 2, American 2. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Historical Tales, Volume 2, American 2, by Charles Morris. Chapter 24. Captain Robert E. Lee and the Lava Beds. The Mexican War, brief as was its period of operations in the field, was marked by many deeds of daring, and also was the scene of the first service in the field of various officers who afterward became prominent in the Civil War. Chief among these were the two great leaders on the opposite sides, General Lee and General Grant. Lee's services in the campaign which Scott conducted against the city of Mexico were especially brilliant, and are likely to be less familiar to the reader than any incident drawn from his well-known record in the Civil War. The most striking among them was his midnight crossing of the lava fields before Contreras. On the 19th of August, 1847, Scott's army lay in and around San Augustine, a place situated on a branch of the main road running south from the city of Mexico. This road divided into two at Churubusco, the other branch running near Contreras. Between these two roads and a ridge of hills south of San Augustine extended a triangular region known as the Pedregal, and about as ugly a place to cross as any ground could well be. It was made up of a vast spread of volcanic rock and scoriae, rent and broken into 1,000 forms, and with sharp ridges and deep fissures, making it very difficult for foot soldiers to get over, and quite impassable for cavalry or artillery. It was like a sea of hardened lava, with no signs of vegetation except a few clumps of bushes and dwarf trees that found footing in the rocks. The only road across it was a difficult, crooked, and barely passable pathway, little better than a mule track, leading from San Augustine to the main road from the city of Mexico. On the plateau beyond this sterile region the Mexicans had gathered in force. Just beyond it General Valencia lay entrenched with his fine division of about 6,000 men and 24 guns, commanding the approach from San Augustine. A mile or more north of Contreras lay General Santa Anna, his force holding the main city road. Such was the situation of the respective armies at the date given, with the Pedregal separating them. Captain Lee, who had already done excellent engineering service at Vera Cruz and Cerro Gordo, assisted by Lieutenants Beauregard and Tower of the engineers, had carefully reconnoitred the position of the enemy, and on the morning of the 19th the advance from San Augustine began, Captain Lee accompanying the troops in their arduous passage across the Pedregal. One of those present thus describes the exploit. Late in the morning of the 19th, the brigade of which my regiment was a part, Riley's, was sent out from San Augustine in the direction of Contreras. We soon struck a region over which it was said no horses could go, and men only with difficulty. No road was available. My regiment was in advance, my company leading, and its point of direction was a church spire at or near Contreras. Taking the lead, we soon struck the Pedregal, a field of volcanic rock like boiling scoria suddenly solidified, pathless, precipitous, and generally compelling rapid gait in order to spring from point to point of rock, on which 2 feet could not rest, and which cut through our shoes. A fall on this sharp material would have seriously cut and injured one, whilst the effort to climb some of it cut the hands. Just before reaching the main road from Contreras to the city of Mexico, we reached a watery ravine, the sides of which were nearly perpendicular, up which I had to be pushed, and then to pull others. On looking back over this bed of lava or scoria, I saw the troops, much scattered, picking their way very slowly, while of my own company, some 80 or 90 strong, only 5 men crossed with me, or during some 20 minutes after. With these 5 I examined the country beyond, and struck upon the small guard of a paymaster's park, which, from the character of the country over which we had passed, was deemed perfectly safe from capture. My men gained a paymaster's chest well filled with bags of silver dollars, and the firing and fuss we made both frightened the guard with the belief that the infernals were upon them, and made our men hasten to our support. Before sundown all of Riley's, and I believe of Cadwallader's, Smith's, and Pierce's brigades were over, and by 9 o'clock a council of war, presided over by Persifer Smith and counselled by Captain R.E. Lee, was held at the church. I have always understood that what was devised and finally determined upon was suggested by Captain Lee. At all events, the council was closed by his saying that he desired to return to General Scott with the decision of General Smith, and that, as it was late, the decision must be given as soon as possible, since General Scott wished him to return in time to give directions for cooperation. During the council, and for hours after, the rain fell in torrents, whilst the darkness was so intense that one could move only by groping. To illustrate, my company again led the way to gain the Mexican rear, and when, after 2 hours of motion, light broke sufficiently to enable us to see a companion a few feet off, we had not moved 400 yards, and the only persons present were half a dozen officers and one guide. Much is said of the perils of war and of the courage necessary to face them. But who would not rather face a firing line of infantry in full daylight than to venture alone in such a dark and stormy night as was this upon such a perilous and threatening region as the Pedregal, in which a misstep in the darkness would surely lead to wounds and perhaps to death? Its crossing, under such conditions, might well be deemed impossible, had not Captain Lee succeeded, borne up by his strong sense of duty, in this daring enterprise. General Scott, who was very anxious to know the position of the advance forces, had sent out 7 officers about sundown, with instructions to the troops at Contreras, but they had all returned, completely baffled by the insuperable difficulties of the way. Not a man except Robert E. Lee had the daring, skill, and persistence to cross this region of volcanic knife-blades on that night of rain and gloom. The writer above quoted from says, "History gives him the credit of having succeeded, but it has always seemed incredible to me when I recollect the distance amid darkness and storm, and the dangers of the Pedregal which he must have traversed. Scarcely a step could be taken without danger of death. But that, to him, a true soldier, was the willing risk of duty in a good cause." General Scott adds his testimony to this by saying, after mentioning the failure of the officers sent out by him, "But the gallant and indefatigable Captain Lee of the Engineers, who has been constantly with the operating forces, is just in from Shields, Smith, Cadwallader, etc., to report and to request that a powerful diversion be made against the centre of the entrenched camp tomorrow morning." Scott subsequently gave the following testimony to the same effect: "Captain Lee, Engineers, came to me from the hamlet Contreras, with a message from Brigadier General Smith about midnight. He, having passed over the difficult ground by daylight, found it just possible to return to St. Augustin in the dark, the greatest feat of physical and moral courage performed by any individual, in my knowledge, pending the campaign." This praise is certainly not misapplied, when we remember that Lee passed over miles of the kind of ground above described, in a pitch-dark night, without light or companion, with no guide but the wind as it drove the pelting rain against his face, or an occasional flash of lightning, and with the danger of falling into the hands of Valencia or Santa Anna if he should happen to stray to the right or the left. It is doubtful if another man in the army would have succeeded in such an enterprise, if any one had the courage to attempt it. It took a man of the calibre which Robert E. Lee afterward proved himself to possess, to perform such a deed of daring. We may briefly describe Lee's connection with the subsequent events. He bore an important part in the operations against the Mexicans, guiding the troops when they set out about 3 o'clock in the morning on a tedious march through darkness, rain, and mud, an elevation in the rear of the enemy's forces being gained about sunrise. An assault was at once made on the surprised Mexicans, their entrenchments were stormed, and in 17 minutes after the charge began, they were in full flight and the American flag was floating proudly above their works. Thus ended the battle of Contreras. Captain Lee was next sent to reconnoitre the well-fortified stronghold of Coyoacan, while another reconnaissance was made toward Churubusco, 1 mile distant. After Lee had completed his task, he was ordered to conduct Pierce's brigade by a third road, to a point from which an attack could be made on the enemy's right and rear. Shields was ordered to follow Pierce closely and take command of the left wing. The battle soon raged violently along the whole line. Shields, in his exposed position, was hard pressed and in danger of being crushed by overwhelming forces. In this alarming situation, Captain Lee made his way to General Scott to report the impending disaster, and led back 2 troops of the Second Dragoons and the Rifles to the support of the left wing. The affair ended in the repulse of the enemy and victory for the Americans. Soon after, a third victory was won at the Moline del Rey. Scott's army was now rapidly approaching the city of Mexico, the central point of all these operations, and the engineer officers, Captain Lee, Lieutenant Beauregard, and others, were kept busy in reconnaissances, which they performed with daring and success. Then quickly followed the boldest and most spectacular exploit of the war, the brilliant charge up the steep heights of Chapultepec, a hill that bristled with walls, mines, and batteries, and whose summit was crowned with a powerful fortress swarming with confident defenders. Up this hill went the American infantry like so many panthers, bounding impetuously onward in face of the hot fire from the Mexican works, scaling crags, clambering up declivities, all with a fiery valor and intrepidity which nothing could check, until the heights were carried, the works scaled, and the enemy put to flight. In this charge, one of the most brilliant in American history, Captain Lee took an active part, till he was disabled by a severe wound and a loss of blood. General Scott again speaks of his service here in complimentary words, saying that he was as distinguished for felicitous execution as for science and daring, and also stating that Captain Lee, so constantly distinguished, also bore important orders from me until he fainted from a wound and the loss of 2 nights' sleep at the batteries. Scott, indeed, had an exalted opinion of Lee's remarkable military abilities, and the Hon. Reverdy Johnson has stated that he had heard General Scott more than once say that his success in Mexico was largely due to the skill, valor, and undaunted energy of Robert E. Lee. In later years, Scott said, "Lee is the greatest military genius in America." Lee's services were not left without reward. He received successfully the brevet rank of major, lieutenant colonel, and colonel, the latter for his service at Chapultepec. The victory at this point was the culminating event of the war. Shortly afterward the Mexican capital was occupied, and the Mexicans soon gave up the contest as hopeless. A new Cortez was in their streets, who was not to be got rid of except at a heavy sacrifice. As to how Lee occupied himself during this period, we may quote an anecdote coming from General Magruder. After the fall of Mexico, when the American army was enjoying the ease and relaxation which it had bought by toil and blood, a brilliant assembly of officers sat over their wine, discussing the operations of the capture, and indulging hopes of a speedy return to the United States. One among them rose to propose the health of the captain of engineers, who had found a way for the army into the city, and then it was remarked that Captain Lee was absent. Magruder was dispatched to bring him to the hall, and departing on his mission, at last found the object of his search in a remote room of the palace, busy on a map. Magruder accosted him and reproached him for his absence. The earnest worker looked up from his labors with the calm, mild gaze which was so characteristic of the man, and pointing to his instruments, shook his head. "But," said Magruder in his impetuous way, "this is mere drudgery. Make somebody else do it, and come with me." "No," was the reply. "No, I am but doing my duty." This is very significant of Lee's subsequent character, in which the demands of duty always outweighed any thought of pleasure or relaxation, and in which his remarkable ability as an engineer was of inestimable advantage to the cause he served. End of chapter 24.
Chapter 25 of Historical Tales, Volume 2, American 2. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Historical Tales, Volume 2, American 2. By Charles Morris. Chapter 25. A Christmas Day on the Plantation. Shall we not break for a time from our record of special tales, and let fall on our pages a bit of winter sunshine from the South, the story of a Christmas festival in the land of the rose and the magnolia? It is a story which has been repeated so many successive seasons in the life of the South that it has grown to be a part of its being, the joyous, festal period in the workday world of the year. The writer once spent Christmas as a guest in the manor house of old Major Delmar, away down south, and feels like halting to tell the tale of genial merry-making and free-hearted enjoyment on that gladsome occasion. On the plantation, Christmas is the beginning and end of the calendar. Time is measured by the days before Christmas or the days since Christmas. There are other seasons of holiday and enjoyment, alike for black and white, but the holidays has one meaning only. It is the merry Christmas time, when the work of the year past is ended, and that of the year to come not begun, and when pleasure and jollity rule supreme. A hearty, whole-souled, genial host, and kindly considerate master was the old Major, in the days of his reign before the war, and fortunate was he who received an invitation to spend the midwinter festival season under his hospitable roof. It was always crowded with well-chosen guests. The members of the family came in from near and far, friends were invited in wholesome numbers, an atmosphere of good will spread all around, from master and mistress downward through the young fry, and to the dusky-faced house-servants and plantation hands. Everybody, great and small, old and young, black and white, was glad at heart when the merry Christmas time came round. As the Yuletide season approached, the work of the plantation was rounded up and everything got ready for the festival. The corn was all in the cribs, the hog killing was at an end, the meat salted or cured, the lard tried out, the sausage meat made. The mincemeat was ready for the Christmas pies, the turkeys were fattened, especially the majestic old gobbler, whose generous weight was to grace the great dish on the manor-house table. The presents were all ready, new shoes, winter clothes, and other useful gifts for the slaves, less useful but more artistic and ornamental remembrances for the household and guests. All this took no small thought and labor, but it was a labor of love, for was it not all meant to make the coming holiday a merry, happy time? I well remember the jolly stir of it all, for my visits spread over the days of busy preparation. In the woods the axe was busy at work, cutting through the tough hickory trunks. Other wood might serve for other seasons, but nothing but good old hickory would do to kindle the Christmas fires. All day long the laden wagons creaked and rumbled along the roads, bringing in the solid logs, and in the wood yards the shining axes rang, making the white chips fly as the great logs were chopped down to the requisite length. From the distant station came the groaning ox cart laden with boxes from the far-off city, boxes full of mysterious wares, the black driver seeking to look as if curiosity did not rend his soul, while he stolidly drove with his precious goods to the store-room. Here they were unloaded with mirthful haste, jokes passing among the laughing workers as to what Massa or Mistus was going to give them out of those heavy crates. The opening of these boxes added fuel to the growing excitement, as the well-wrapped-up parcels were taken out, in some cases openly, in other cases with a mysterious secrecy that doubled the curiosity and added to the season's charm. There was another feature of the work of preparation in which all were glad to take part, the gathering of the evergreens. Red-berried holly, mistletoe with its glistening pearls, ground pine, moss, and other wood treasures, for the decoration of the parlour, hall, and dining-room, and, above all, of the old village church, a gleeful labour in which the whole neighbourhood took part, and helpers came from miles away. Young men and blooming maidens alike joined in, some as artists in decorations, others as busy workers, and all as merry aids. Days rolled on while all this was being done, the wood chopped and heaped away in the woodsheds and under the back portico, the church and house made as green as springtide with their abundant decorations, tastefully arranged in wreaths and folds and circles, with the great green Merry Christmas welcoming all corners from over the high parlour mantel. All was finished in ample time before the day of Christmas Eve arrived, though there were dozens of final touches still to be made, last happy thoughts that had to be worked out in green, red, or white. On that same day came the finish which all had wished but scarcely dared hope for, a fleecy fall of snow that drifted in feathery particles down through the still atmosphere, and covered the ground with an inch-deep carpet of white. I well remember old Delmar with his wrinkled, kindly face and abundant white hair, and his "By Jove, isn't this just the thing?" as he stood on the porch and looked with boyish glee at the fast-falling flakes. And I remember as well his sweet-faced wife, small, delicate, yet still pretty in her old age, and placidly sharing his enjoyment of the spectacle, rare enough in that climate, in spite of the tradition that a freeze and a snowfall always came with the Christmas season. Christmas Eve! That was a time indeed! Parlour and hall, porch and woodshed, all were well enough in their way, but out in the kitchen busy things were going on without which the whole festival would have been sadly incomplete. The stoves were heaped with hickory and glowing with ardent heat, their ovens crammed full of toothsome preparations, while about the tables and shelves clustered the mistress of the place and her regiment of special assistants, many of them famous for their skill in some branch of culinary art, their glistening faces and shining teeth testifying to their pride in their one special talent. Pies and puddings, cakes and tarts, everything that could be got ready in advance, were being drawn from the ovens and heaped on awaiting shelves, while a dozen hands busied themselves in getting ready the turkey and game and the other essentials of the coming feast that had to wait till the next day for their turn at the heated ovens. As the day moved on, the excitement grew. Visitors were expected, the boys from college with their invited chums, sons and grandsons, aunts and cousins, and invited guests from near and far. Not only these, but hired out servants from neighbouring towns, whose terms were fixed from New Year to Christmas, so that they could spend the holiday week at home, made their appearance and were greeted with as much hilarious welcome in the cabins as were the white guests in the mansion. In the manor house itself they were welcomed like home-coming members of the family, as already wearing their presents of new winter clothes, they came to pay their respects to Massa and Mistis. As the day went on, the carriages were sent to the railroad station for the expected visitors, old and young, and a growing impatience testified to the warmth of welcome with which their arrival would be greeted. They are late. To be late seems a fixed feature of the situation, especially when the roads are heavy with unwonted snow. Night has fallen, the stars are out in the skies, before the listening ears on the porch first catch the distant creak of wheels and axles. The glow of the wood fires on the hearths and of candles on table and mantel is shining out far over the snow, when at length the carriages come in sight, laden outside and in with trunks and passengers whose cheery voices and gay calls have already heralded their approach. What a time there is when they arrive! The boys and girls tumbling and leaping out and flying up the steps to be met with warm embraces or genial welcomes, the elders coming more sedately, to be received with earnest hand-clasps and cordial greetings. Never was there a happier man than the old Major when he saw his house filled with guests, and bade the strangers welcome with a dignified but earnest courtesy. But when the younger Corners stormed him, with their glad shouts of "Uncle" or "Grandpa," or other titles of relationship, and their jovial echo of "Merry Christmas," the warm-hearted old fellow seemed fairly transformed into a boy again. Guest as I was, I felt quite taken off my feet by the flood of greetings, and was swept into the general overflow of high spirits and joyful welcomes. The frosty poll of the Major and the silvery hair of his good wife were significant of venerable age, but there were younger people in the family, and with them a fair sprinkling of children. Of these, the diminutive stockings were duly hung in a row over the big fireplace, waiting for the expected coming of Santa Claus, while their late wearers were soon huddled in bed, though with little hope of sleep in the excitement and sense of enchantment that surrounded them. Their disappearance made little void in the crowd that filled the parlour, a gay and merry throng, full of the spirit of fun and hearty enjoyment, and thoroughly genuine in their mirth, not a grain of airiness or ostentation marring their pleasure, though in its way it was as refined as in more showy circles. Morning dawned, Christmas morning. Little chance was there for sleepy heads to indulge themselves that sunny Yuletide morn. The stir began long before the late sun had risen, that of the children first of all, stealing about like tiny white-clad spectres, with bulging stockings tucked tightly in their arms, craftily opening bedroom doors and shouting "Christmas gift" at drowsy slumberers, then scurrying away and seeking the hearth-side, whose embers yielded light enough for a first glance at their treasures. Soon the opening and closing of doors was heard, and one by one the older inmates of the mansion appeared, with warm Merry Christmas greetings, and all so merry-hearted that the breakfast-table was a constant round of quips and jokes, and of stories and pranks played in the night by representatives of Santa Claus. Where all are bent on having a good time, it is wonderful how little will serve to kindle laughter and set joy afloat. Aside from the church-going, with the hymns and anthems sung in concert and the reading of the service, the special event of the day was the distribution of the mysterious contents of the great boxes which had come days before. There were presents for every one, Nobody, guest or member of the family, was forgotten, and whether costly or homely but useful, the gifts seemed to give equal joy. It was the season of good will, in which the kindly thought, not the costliness of the gift, was alone considered, and when all tokens of kindliness were accepted in the same spirit of gratefulness and enjoyment. A special feature of a Christmas on the plantation, especially before the war, was the row of shining, happy black faces that swarmed up to the great house in the morning light with their mellow outcry of "Merry Christmas, Massa! Merry Christmas, Missus!" and their hopeful looks and eyes bulging with expectation. Joyful was the time when their gifts were handed out, useful articles of clothing, household goods, and the like, all gladly and hilariously received, with a joy as childlike as that of the little ones with their stockings. Off they tripped merrily through the snow with their burdens, laughing and joking, to their cabins, where dinners awaited them which were humble copies of that preparing for the guests at the master's table. Turkey was not wanting, varied here and there by that rare dish of raccoon or possum, which the Southern darky so highly enjoys. The great event of the mansion house was the dinner. All day till the dinner hour the kitchen was full of busy preparation for this crowning culmination of the festival. Cooks there were in plenty, and the din of their busy labor, and the perfume of their culinary triumphs, seemed to pervade the whole house. When the dinner was served, it was a sight to behold. The solid old mahogany table groaned with the weight laid upon it. In the place of honor was the big gobbler, brown as a berry and done to a turn. For those who preferred other meat, there was a huge round of venison and an artistically ornamented ham. These formed the backbone of the feast, but with and around them were every vegetable and delicacy that a Southern garden could provide, and tasteful dishes which it took all the ingenuity of a trained mistress of the kitchen to prepare. This was the season to test the genius of the dusky Southern cooks, and they had exhausted their art and skill for that day's feast. On the ample sideboard, shining with glass, was the abundant dessert, the cakes, pies, puddings, and other aids to a failing appetite that had been devised the day before. That this dinner was done honor to need scarcely be said. The journey the day before, and the outdoor exercise in that day's frosty air, had given every one an excellent appetite, and the appearance of the table at the end of the feast showed that the skill of Aunt Dinah and her assistants had been amply appreciated. After dinner came apple toddy and eggnog, and the great ovation to the Christmas good cheer was at an end. But the festival was not over. Games and dances followed the feast. The piano top was lifted, and light fingers rattled out lively music, to which 100 flying feet quickly responded. Country dances they were, the lancers and quadrilles. Round dances were still looked upon in that rural locality as an improper innovation. The good old Major, in his frock coat and high collar, started the ball, seizing the prettiest girl by the hand and leading her to the head of the room, while the others quickly followed in pairs. Thus, with the touch of nimble fingers on the ivory keys, and the tap of feet, and the whirl of skirts over the unwaxed floor, mingled with jest and mirth, the evening passed gaily on, the old-fashioned Virginia reel closing the ball, and bringing the day's busy reign of festivity to an end. But the whites did not have all the fun to themselves. The colored folks had their parties and festivities as well, their mistresses superintending the suppers and decorating the tables with their own hands, while ladies and gentlemen from the mansion came to look on, an attention which was considered a compliment by the ebon guests. And the Christmas season rarely passed without a colored wedding, the holidays being specially chosen for this interesting ceremony. The dining room or the hall of the mansion often served for this occasion, the master joining in matrimony the happy couple, or a colored preacher might perform the ceremony in the quarters. But in either case the event went gaily off, the family attending to get what amusement they could out of the occasion, while the mistress arranged the trousseau for the dusky bride. But it is with the one Christmas only that we are here concerned, and that ended as happily and merrily as it had begun, midnight passing before the festivities came to an end. How many happy dreams followed the day of joy, and how many nightmares the heavy feast, is more than we are prepared to put on record. End of chapter 25.
Chapter 26 of Historical Tales, Volume 2, American 2. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Historical Tales, Volume 2, American 2, by Charles Morris. Chapter 26. Captain Gordon and the Raccoon Roughs. The outbreak of the Civil War, the most momentous conflict of recent times, was marked by a wave of fervent enthusiasm in the States of the South which swept with the swiftness of a prairie fire over the land. Pouring in multitudes into the centers of enlistment, thousands and tens of thousands of stalwart men offered their services in defense of their cause, gathering into companies and regiments far more rapidly than they could be absorbed. This state of affairs, indeed, existed in the North as well as in the South, but it is with the extraordinary fervor of patriotism in the latter that we are here concerned, and especially with the very interesting experience of General John B. Gordon, as related by him in his Reminiscence of the Civil War. When the war began, Gordon, as he tells us, was practically living in 3 states. His house was in Alabama, his post office in Tennessee, and he was engaged in coal mining enterprises in the mountains of Georgia, the locality being where these 3 states meet in a point. No sooner was the coming conflict in the air than the stalwart mountaineers of the mining district became wild with eagerness to fight for the Confederacy, and Gordon, in whom the war spirit burned as hotly as in any of them, needed but a word to gather about him a company of volunteers. They unanimously elected him their captain, and organized themselves at once into a cavalry company, most of them, like so many sons of the South, much preferring to travel on horseback than on foot. As yet the war was only a probability, and no volunteers had been called for, but with the ardor that had brought them together, Gordon's company hastened to offer their services, only to be met with the laconic and disappointing reply, "No cavalry now needed." What was to be done? They did not relish the idea of giving up their horses, yet they wanted to fight still more than to ride, and the fear came upon them that if they waited till cavalry was needed, they might be quite lost sight of in that mountain corner, and the war end before they could take a hand in it. This notion of a quick end to the war was common enough at that early day, very few foreseeing the vastness of the impending conflict. And dreading that they might be left out in the cold, the ardent mountaineers took a vote on the question, "Shall we dismount and go as infantry?" The motion was carried with a shout of approval, and away went the stalwart recruits, without arms, without uniform, without military training, with little beyond the thirst to fight, the captain knowing hardly more of military tactics than his men. They had courage and enthusiasm, and felt that all things besides would come to them. As for arms suitable for modern warfare, the South at that time was sadly lacking in them. Men looked up their old double-barreled shotguns and squirrel rifles, and Governor Brown of Georgia set men at work making what were called Joe Brown's pikes, being a sort of steel-pointed lances or bayonets on poles, like those used by pikemen in medieval warfare. In modern war they were about as useful as knitting needles would have been. Governor Brown knew this well enough, but the volunteers were coming in such numbers, and were so eager to fight, that the pikes were made more to satisfy them than with the hope of there being any service in actual war. Gordon's company was among the earliest of these volunteers. Reluctantly leaving their horses, and not waiting for orders, they bade a quick adieu to all they had held dear, and set off cheerily for Milledgeville, then the capital of Georgia. They were destined to a sad disappointment. On reaching Atlanta they were met by a telegram from the governor, who had been advised of their coming, telling them to go back home and wait until advised that they were wanted. This was like a shower of cold water poured on the ardor of the volunteers. Go home? After they had cut loose from their homes and started for the war? They would do nothing of the kind. They were on foot to fight, and would not consent to be turned back by Governor Brown or any one else. The captain felt very much like his men. He, too, was an eager Confederate patriot, but his position was one demanding obedience to the constituted authorities, and by dint of much persuasion, and a cautious exercise of his new authority, he induced his men to board the train heading back for their homes. But the repressed anger of the rebellious mountaineers broke forth again when the engine bell rang and the whistle gave its shrill starting signal. Some of the men rushed forward and tore out the coupling of the foremost car, and the engine was left in condition to make its journey alone. While the trainmen looked on in astonishment, the mountaineers sprang from the train, gathered round their captain, and told him that they had made up their minds on the matter and were not going back. They had enlisted for the war and intended to go to it. If Governor Brown would not take them, some other governor would. There was nothing left for the young captain but to lead his undisciplined and rebellious company through Atlanta in search of a suitable camping place. Their disregard of discipline did not trouble him greatly, for in his heart he sympathized with them, and he knew well that in their rude earnestness was the stuff of which good soldiers are made. Gordon gives an interesting and amusing description of the appearance his men made and the interest they excited in Atlanta's streets. These were filled with citizens, who looked upon the motley crew with a feeling in which approval was tempered by mirth. The spectacle of the march, or rather the straggle, of the mountaineers was one not soon to be forgotten. Utterly untrained in marching, they walked at will, no two keeping step, while no two were dressed alike. There were almost as many different hues and cuts in their raiment as there were men in their ranks. The nearest approach to a uniform was in their rough fur caps made of raccoon skins, and with the streaked and bushy tail of the raccoon hanging down behind. The amusement of the people was mingled with curiosity. "Are you the captain of this company?" some of them asked Gordon, who was rather proud of his men, and saw nothing of the grotesque in their appearance. "I am, sir," he replied, in a satisfied tone. "What company is it, captain?" As yet the company had no name other than the one which he had chosen as fine-sounding and suitable, but had not yet mentioned to the men. "This company is the Mountain Rifles," said the captain proudly. His pride was destined to a fall. From a tall mountaineer in the ranks came, in words not intended for his ears, but plainly audible, the disconcerting words, "Mountain hell! We're no Mountain Rifles, we're the Raccoon Roughs." And Raccoon Roughs they continued through all the war, Gordon's fine-spun name being never heard of again. The feeble remnant of the war-scarred company which was mustered out at Appomattox was still known as Raccoon Roughs. Who would have them, since Governor Brown would not, was now the question. Telegrams sped out right and left to the governors of other states, begging a chance for the upland patriots. An answer came at length from Governor Moore of Alabama, who consented to incorporate the Raccoon Roughs and their captain in one of the new regiments he was organizing. Gordon gladly read the telegram to his eager company, and from their 100 throats came the first example of the rebel yell he had ever heard, a wild and thrilling roar that was to form the inspiration to many a mad charge in later years. No time was lost by the gallant fellows in setting out on their journey to Montgomery. As they went on they found the whole country in a blaze of enthusiasm. No one who saw the scene would have doubted for a moment that the South was an ardent unit in support of its cause. By day the troop trains were wildly cheered as they passed. At night bonfires blazed on the hills, and torchlight processions paraded the streets of the towns. As no cannon were at hand to salute the incoming volunteers, blacksmith anvils took their place, ringing with the blows of hammers swung by muscular arms. Every station was a throng of welcoming people, filling the air with shouts and the lively sound of fife and drum, and bearing banners of all sizes and shapes, on which Southern independence was proclaimed, and the last dollar and man pledged to the cause. The women were out as enthusiastically as the men, staid matrons and ardent maids springing upon the cars, pinning blue cockades on the lapels of the new soldiers' coats, and singing the war songs already in vogue, the favorite Dixie and the Bonnie Blue Flag, in whose chorus the harsh voices of the Raccoon Roughs mingled with the musical tones of their fair admirers. Montgomery was at length reached, to find it thronged with shouting volunteers, every man of them burning with enthusiasm. Mingled with them were visiting statesmen and patriotic citizens, for that city was the cradle of the new-born Confederacy and the center of Southern enthusiasm. Every heart was full of hope, every face marked with energy, a prayer for the success of the cause on every lip. Never had more fervent and universal enthusiasm been seen. On the hills and around the Capitol cannon boomed welcome to the inflowing volunteers, wagons rumbled by carrying arms and ammunition to the camps. On every street marched untrained but courageous recruits. As for the Raccoon Roughs, Governor Moore kept his word, assigning them to a place in the 6th Alabama Regiment, of which Captain Gordon, unexpectedly and against his wishes, was unanimously elected major. Such were the scenes which the coming war excited in the far South, such the fervid enthusiasm with which the coming conflict for Southern independence was hailed. So vast was the number of volunteers, in companies and in regiments, each eager to be accepted, that the Hon. Leroy P. Walker, the first Secretary of War of the Confederacy, was fairly overwhelmed by the flood of applicants that poured in on him day and night. Their captains and colonels waylaid him on the streets to urge the immediate acceptance of their services, and he was obliged to seek his office by roundabout ways to avoid the flood of importunities. It is said that before the Confederate government left Montgomery for Richmond, about 360,000 volunteers, very many of them from the best element of the Southern population, had offered to devote their lives and fortunes to their country's cause. Many striking examples of this outburst of enthusiasm and patriotic devotion might be adduced, but we must content ourselves with one, cited as an instance in point by General Gordon. This was the case of Mr. W. C. Hayward of South Carolina, a West Point graduate and a man of fortune and position. The Confederate government was no sooner organized than Mr. Hayward sought Montgomery, tendering his service and those of a full regiment enlisted by him for the war. Such was the pressure upon the authorities, and so far beyond the power of absorption at that time the offers of volunteers, that Mr. Hayward sought long in vain for an interview with the Secretary of War. When this was at last obtained, he found the ranks so filled that it was impossible to accept his regiment. Returning home in deep disappointment, but with his patriotism unquenched, this wealthy and trained soldier joined the Home Guards and died in the war as a private in the ranks. Such was the unanimity with which the sons of the South, hosts of them armed with no better weapons than the old-fashioned flint and steel muskets, double-barreled shotguns, and long-barreled squirrel rifles, rushed to the defense of their states, with a spontaneous and burning enthusiasm that has never been surpassed. The impulse of self-defense was uppermost in their hearts. It was not the question of the preservation of slavery that sustained them in the terrible conflict for 4 years of desolating war. It was far more that of the sovereignty of the States. The South maintained that the Union formed under the Constitution was one of consent and not of force, that each State retained the right to resume its independence on sufficient cause, and that the Constitution gave no warrant for the attempt to invade and coerce a sovereign State. It was for this, not to preserve slavery, that the people sprang as one man to arms and fought as men had rarely fought before. End of chapter 26.
Chapter 27 of Historical Tales, Volume 2, American 2. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Historical Tales, Volume 2, American 2, by Charles Morris. Chapter 27, Stuart's famous Chambersburg Raid. Of all the minor operations of the Civil War, the one most marked at once by daring and success was the pioneer invasion of the Northern States, the notable Chambersburg raid of the most famous cavalry leader of the Confederacy, General J.E.B. Stuart. This story of bold venture and phenomenal good fortune, though often told, is worth giving again in its interesting details. The interim after the battle of Sharpsburg or Antietam was one of rest and recuperation in both the armies engaged. During this period the cavalry of Lee's army was encamped in the vicinity of Charlestown, some 10 miles to the southward of Harper's Ferry. Stuart's headquarters were located under the splendid oaks which graced the lawn of the Bower, whose proprietor, Mr. A. S. Dandridge, entertained the officers with an open-hearted and genial hospitality which made their stay one of great pleasure and enjoyment. There were warriors in plenty who would not have been hasty to break up that agreeable period of rest and social intercourse, but Stuart was not of that class. He felt that he must be up and doing, demonstrating that the Army of Northern Virginia had not gone to sleep, and the early days of October, 1862, saw a stir about headquarters which indicated that something out of the ordinary was afoot. During the evening of the 8th the officers were engaged in a lively social intercourse with the ladies of the Bower, the entertainment ending in a serenade in which the banjo and fiddle took chief part. Warlike affairs seemed absent from the thoughts of all, with the exception that the general devoted more time than usual to his papers. With the morning of the 9th a new state of affairs came on. The roads suddenly appeared full of well-mounted and well-appointed troopers, riding northward with jingling reins and genial calls, while the cheery sound of the bugle rang through the fresh morning air. There were 1,800 of these horsemen selected from the best mounted and most trustworthy men in the corps, for they were chosen for an expedition that would need all their resources of alertness, activity, and self-control, no less a one than an invasion of Pennsylvania, a perilous enterprise in which the least error might expose them all to capture or death. On reaching the appointed place of rendezvous, at Darksville, Stuart issued an address in which he advised his followers that the enterprise in which they were to engage demanded the greatest coolness, decision, and courage, implicit obedience to orders, and the strictest order and sobriety. While the full purpose of the expedition must still be kept secret, he said, it was one in which success would reflect the highest credit on their arms. The seizure of private property in the state of Maryland was strictly prohibited, and it was to be done in Pennsylvania only under orders from the brigade commanders, individual plundering being strongly forbidden. These preliminaries adjusted, the march northward began, the command being divided into 3 detachments of 600 men each, under the direction of General Wade Hampton, Colonel W. H. F. Lee, and Colonel W. E. Jones. A battery of 4 guns accompanied the expedition. It was with high expectations that the men rode forward, the secrecy of the enterprise giving it an added zest. Most of them had followed Stuart in daring rides in the earlier months of the year, and all were ready to follow wherever he chose to lead. Darkness had fallen when they reached Hedgesville, the point on the Potomac where it was designed to cross. Here they bivouacked for the night, a select party of some 30 men being sent across the river, their purpose being to capture the Federal picket on the Maryland side. In this they failed, but the picket was cut off from its reserve, so that the fugitives were not able to report the attack. Day had not dawned when all the men were in their saddles, and as soon as word of the result of the night's enterprise was received, the foremost troops plunged into the river, and the crossing began. It was completed without difficulty, and Colonel Butler, leading the advance, rode briskly forward to the National Turnpike which joins Hancock and Hagerstown. Along this road, a few hours before, General Cox's division of Federal infantry had passed, Butler coming so close to his rear that the stragglers were captured. But a heavy fog covered the valley and hid all things from sight, so that Cox continued his march in ignorance that a strong body of Confederate cavalry was so close upon his track. On Fairview Heights near the road was a Federal signal station which a squad was sent to capture. The 2 officers in charge of it escaped, but 2 privates and all its equipment were taken. Yet despite all efforts at secrecy, the march had not gone on unseen. A citizen had observed the crossing and reported it to Captain Logan of the 12th Illinois Cavalry, and the news spread with much rapidity. But there was no strong force of cavalry available to check the movement, and Stuart's braves passed steadily forward unopposed. Their line of march was remote from telegraph or railroad, and the Pennsylvania farmers, who did not dream of the war invading their fields, were stricken with consternation when Stuart's bold riders crossed Mason and Dixon's line and appeared on their soil. It was hard for them to believe it. One old gentleman, whose sorrel mare was taken from his cart, protested bitterly, saying that orders from Washington had forbidden the impressment of horses, and threatening the vengeance of the government on the supposed Federal raiders. A shoe merchant at Mercersburg completely equipped Butler's advance guard with footwear, and was sadly surprised when paid with a receipt calling on the Federal government to pay for damages. While nothing was disturbed in Maryland, horses were diligently seized in Pennsylvania, the country on both sides of the line of march being swept clean of its farm animals. Ladies on the road, however, were not molested, and the men were strictly prohibited from seizing private property, even from taking provisions for themselves. Chambersburg, the goal of the expedition, was reached on the evening of the 10th, after a day's hard ride. So rapid and well conducted had been the journey that as yet scarce one enemy had been seen, and when the town was called on to surrender within 30 minutes, under penalty of a bombardment, resistance was out of the question. There was no one capable of resisting, and the troops were immediately marched into the town, where they were drawn up in the public square. The bank was the first place visited. Colonel Butler, under orders from his chief, entered the building and demanded its funds. But the cashier assured him that it was empty of money, all its cash having been sent away that morning. and convinced him of this by opening the safe and drawers for his inspection. Telegraphic warning had evidently reached the town. Butler had acted with such courtesy that the cashier now called the ladies of his family and bade them to prepare food for the men who had made the search. That the captors of the town behaved with like courtesy throughout, we have the evidence of Colonel A. K. McClure, subsequently editor of the Philadelphia Times, who then dwelt in the near vicinity of Chambersburg. Though a United States officer and subject to arrest or parole, and though he had good opportunity to escape, he resolved to stay and share the fate of his fellow townsmen. We quote from his description of the incidents of that night. After speaking of an interview he had, as one of the committee of 3 citizens to surrender the town, with General Hampton, and the courteous manner of the latter, he proceeds: "With 60 acres of corn in shock, and 3 barns full of grain, excellent farm and saddle horses, and a number of best blooded cattle, the question of property was worthy of a thought. I resolved to stay, as I felt so bound by the terms of surrender, and take my chances of discovery and parole. I started in advance of them for my house, but not in time to save the horses. I confidently expected to be overrun by them, and to find the place one scene of desolation in the morning. I resolved, however, that things should be done soberly, if possible, and I had just time to destroy all the liquors about the house. As their pickets were all around me, I could not get it off. I finished just in time, for they were soon upon me in force, and every horse in the barn, 10 in all, was promptly equipped and mounted by a rebel cavalryman. They passed on towards Shippensburg, leaving a picket force on the road. In an hour they returned with all the horses they could find, and dismounted to spend the night on the turnpike in front of my door. It was now midnight, and I sat on the porch observing their movements. They had my best cornfield beside them, and their horses fared well. In a little while one entered the yard, came up to me, and after a profound bow, politely asked for a few coals to start a fire. I supplied him, and informed him as blandly as possible where he would find wood conveniently, as I had dim visions of camp fires made from my palings. I was thanked in return, and the mild-mannered villain proceeded at once to strip the fence and kindle fires. Soon after, a squad came and asked permission to get some water. I piloted them to the pump, and again received a profusion of thanks. About 1 o'clock, half a dozen officers came to the door and asked to have some coffee made for them, offering to pay liberally for it in Confederate scrip. After concluding a treaty with them on behalf of the colored servants, coffee was promised them, and they then asked for a little bread with it. They were wet and shivering, and seeing a bright open wood fire in the library, they asked permission to enter and warm themselves until their coffee should be ready, assuring me that under no circumstances should anything in the house be disturbed by their men. I had no alternative but to accept them as my guests until it might please them to depart, and I did so with as good grace as possible. Once seated round the fire, all reserve seemed to be forgotten on their part, and they opened a general conversation on politics, the war, the different battles, the merits of generals of both armies. They spoke with entire freedom upon every subject but their movement into Chambersburg. Most of them were men of more than ordinary intelligence and culture, and their demeanour was in all respects eminently courteous. I took a cup of coffee with them, and have never seen anything more keenly relished. They said that they had not tasted coffee for weeks before, and that then they had paid from $6 to $10 per pound for it. When they were through, they asked whether there was any coffee left, and finding that there was some, they proposed to bring some more officers and a few privates, who were prostrated by exposure, to get what was left. They were, of course, as welcome as those present, and on they came in squads of 5 or more, until every grain of brown coffee was exhausted. Then they asked for tea, and that was served to some 20 more. In the meantime, a subordinate officer had begged of me a little bread for himself and a few men, and he was supplied in the kitchen. He was followed by others in turn, until nearly 100 had been supplied with something to eat or drink. All, however, politely asked permission to enter the house, and behaved with entire propriety. They did not make a single rude or profane remark even to the servants. In the meantime, the officers who had first entered the house had filled their pipes from the box of killikinnick on the mantel, after being assured that smoking was not offensive, and we had another hour of free talk on matters generally. At 4 o'clock in the morning the welcome blast of the bugle was heard, and they rose hurriedly to depart. Thanking me for the hospitality they had received, we parted, mutually expressing the hope that should we ever meet again, it would be under more pleasant circumstances. In a few minutes they were mounted and moved into Chambersburg. About 7 o'clock I went into town. General Stuart sat on his horse in the centre of the town, surrounded by his staff, and his command was coming in from the country in large squads, leading their old horses and riding the new ones they had found in the stables hereabouts. General Stuart is of medium size, has a keen eye, and wears immense sandy whiskers and a moustache. His demeanour to our people was that of a humane soldier. In several instances his men commenced to take private property from stores, but they were arrested by General Stuart's provost guard. In a single instance only that I heard of, did they enter a store by intimidating the proprietor. All of our stores and shops were closed, and with a very few exceptions, were not disturbed. This was certainly not like the usual behaviour of soldiers on foreign soil, and the incident at once illustrates the strict control which General Stuart held over his men, and the character of the men themselves, largely recruited as they were from the higher class of Southern society. Though Colonel McClure evidently felt that the lion's claws lay concealed under the silken glove, he certainly saw no evidence of it in the manners of his unbidden guests. Return was now the vital question before General Stuart and his band. Every hour of delay added to the dangers surrounding them. Troops were hastily marching to cut off their retreat, cavalry was gathering to intercept them, scouts were watching every road and every movement. Worst of all was the rain, which had grown heavy in the night, and was now falling steadily, with a threat of swelling the Potomac and making its fords impassable. The ride northward had been like a holiday excursion. What would the ride southward prove? With the dawn of the day, the head of the column set out on the road toward Gettysburg, no damage being done in the town except to railroad property and the ordnance storehouse, which contained a large quantity of ammunition and other army supplies. This was set on fire, and the sound of the explosion, after the flames reached the powder, came to the ears of the vanguard when already at a considerable distance on the return route. At Cashtown the line turned from the road to Gettysburg and moved southward, horses being still diligently collected till the Maryland line was crossed, when all gathering of spoils ceased. Emmitsburg was reached about sunset, the hungry cavaliers there receiving a warm welcome, and being supplied with food as bountifully as the means of the inhabitants permitted. Meanwhile, the Federal military authorities were busy with efforts to cut off the venturesome band. The difficulty was to know at what point on the Potomac a crossing would be sought, and the troops were held in suspense until Stuart's movements should unmask his purpose. General Pleasonton and his cavalry force were kept in uncertain movement, now riding to Hagerstown, then, on false information, going 4 miles westward, then, halted by fresh orders, turning east and riding to Mechanicsstown, 20 miles from Hagerstown. They had marched 50 miles that day, 8 of which were wasted, and when they halted, Stuart was passing within 4 miles of them without their knowledge. Midnight brought Pleasonton word of Stuart's movements, and the weary men and horses were put on the road again, reaching the mouth of the Monocacy about 8 o'clock the next morning. But most of his command had dropped behind in that exhausting ride of 78 miles within 28 hours, only some 400 of them being still with him. While the Federals were thus making every effort to cut off the bold raiders and to garrison the fords through a long stretch of the Potomac, Stuart was riding south from Emmitsburg, after a brief stop at that place, seeking to convey the impression by his movements that he proposed to try some of the upper and nearer fords. His real purpose was to seek a crossing lower down, so near to the main body of the Federals that they would not look for him there. Yet the dangers were growing with every moment. 3 brigades of infantry guarded the lower fords. Pleasonton was approaching the Monocacy, and it looked as if the bold raider was in a net from which there could be no escape. Stuart reached Hyattstown at daylight on the 12th, having marched 65 miles in 20 hours. The abundance of captured horses enabled him to make rapid changes for the guns and caissons, and to continue the march without delay. 2 miles from Hyattstown the road entered a large piece of woodland which served to conceal his movements from observation from any signal tower. Here a disused road was found, and turning abruptly to the west, a rapid ride was made under cover. Soon after the open country was reached again, a Federal squadron was encountered, but it was dispersed by a charge, and from this point a rapid ride was made for White's Ford, the nearest available crossing. All now seemed to depend upon whether this ford was occupied in force by the enemy. As Colonel Lee approached it, this question was settled. What appeared a large body of Federal infantry was in possession, posted on a steep bluff quite close to the ford. It seemed impossible to dislodge it, but foes were closing up rapidly from behind, and if all was not to be lost, something must be done, and done at once. To attack the men on the bluff seemed hopeless, and before doing so, Lee tried the effect of putting a bold face on the matter. He sent a messenger under a flag of truce, telling the Federal commander that Stuart's whole force was before him, that resistance was useless, and calling on him to surrender. If this was not done in 15 minutes, a charge in force would be made. The 15 minutes passed. No sign of yielding appeared. Lee, with less than a forlorn hope of success, opened fire with his guns and ordered his men to advance. He listened for the roar of the Federal guns in reply, when a wild shout rang along the line. "They are retreating! Hurrah! They are retreating!" Such was indeed the case. The infantry on the bluff were marching away with flying flags and beating drums, abandoning their position without a shot. A loud Confederate cheer followed them as they marched. No shot was fired to hinder them. Their movement was the salvation of Stuart's corps, for it left an open passage to the ford, and safety was now assured. But there was no time to lose. Pleasonton and his men might be on them at any minute. Other forces of the enemy were rapidly closing in. Haste was the key to success. One piece of artillery was hurried over the dry bed of the canal, across the river ford, and up the Virginia bluff, where it was posted to command the passage. Another gun was placed so as to sweep the approaches on the Maryland side, and soon a stream of horsemen were rapidly riding through the shallow water to Virginia and safety. With them went a long train of horses captured from Pennsylvania farms. Up came the others and took rapidly to the water, Pelham, meanwhile, facing Pleasonton with a single gun, which was served with all possible rapidity. But there was one serious complication. Butler with the rear guard had not yet arrived, and no one knew just where he was. Stuart, in deep concern for his safety, sent courier after courier to hasten his steps, but no tidings came back. "I fear it is all up with Butler," he said despondently. "I cannot get word of him, and the enemy is fast closing in on his path." "Let me try to reach him," said Captain Blackford, to whom the general had spoken. After a moment's hesitation, Stuart replied, "All right. If we don't meet again, good-bye, old fellow. You run a desperate chance of being raked in." Away went Blackford at full speed, passing the lagging couriers one by one, and at length reaching Butler, whom he found halted and facing the enemy, in complete ignorance of what was going on at the front. He had his own and a North Carolina regiment and one gun. "We are crossing the ford, and Stuart orders you up at once," shouted Blackford. "Withdraw at a gallop, or you will be cut off." "Very good," said Butler coolly, "but how about that gun? I fear the horses can't get it off in time." "Let the gun go. Save yourself and your men." Butler did not see it in that light. Whip and spur were applied to the weary artillery horses, and away they went down the road, whirling the gun behind them, and followed at a gallop by Butler and his men. As they turned towards the ford, they were saluted by the fire of a Federal battery. Further on, the distant fire of infantry from down the river reached them with spent balls. 10 minutes later, and the rear guard would have been lost. As it was, a wild dash was made across the stream, and soon the last man stood on Virginia soil. The expedition was at an end, and the gallant band was on its native heath once more. Thus ended Stuart's famous 2 days' ride. The first crossing of the Potomac had been on the morning of the 10th. The final crossing was on the morning of the 12th. Within 27 hours he had ridden 80 miles from Chambersburg to White's Ford, with his artillery and captured horses, and had crossed the Potomac under the eyes of much superior numbers, his only losses being the wounding of 1 man and the capture of 2 who had dropped out of the line of march. A remarkable record of success, considering the great peril of the expedition. The gains of the enterprise were about 1,200 horses, but the great strain of the ride forced the men to abandon many of their own. Stuart lost 2 of his most valued animals, Suffolk and Lady Margrave, through the carelessness of his servant Bob, who, overcome by too free indulgence in ardent spirits, fell out of the line to take a nap, and ended by finding himself and his horses in hostile hands. The value of the property destroyed at Chambersburg, public and railroad, was estimated at $250,000. A few hundred sick and wounded soldiers were paroled, and about 30 officials and prominent citizens were brought off as prisoners, to be held as hostages for imprisoned citizens of the Confederacy. On the whole, it was eminently a daredevil enterprise of the type of the knightly forays of old, its results far less in importance than the risk of loss to the Confederacy had that fine body of cavalry been captured. Yet it was of the kind of ventures calculated to improve the morale of an army, and inspire its men to similar deeds of daring and success. Doubtless it gave the cue to Morgan's later and much less fortunate invasion of the North. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of Historical Tales, Volume 2, American 2. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Historical Tales, Volume 2, American 2, by Charles Morris. Chapter 28 Forrest's Chase of the Raiders. Foremost in dash and daring among the cavalry leaders of the Confederacy was Lieutenant General Nathan B. Forrest, a hero in the saddle, some of whose exploits were like the marvels of romance. There is one of his doings in particular, which General Lord Wolseley says reads like a romance. This was his relentless pursuit and final capture of the expedition under Colonel Abel D. Streit, one of the most brilliant deeds in the cavalry history of the war. Accepting Wolseley's opinion, we give the story of this exploit. In General Rosecrans's campaign against General Bragg, it was a matter of importance to him to cut the railroad lines and destroy bridges, arsenals, etc., in Bragg's rear. He wished particularly to cut the railroads leading from Chattanooga to Atlanta and Nashville, and thus prevent the free movement of troops. The celebrated Andrews expedition of scouts, described in a previous volume of this series, failed in an effort to do this work. Colonel Streit, a stalwart, daring cavalry leader, made a second effort to accomplish it, and would doubtless have succeeded but for the bulldog-like persistence with which that devil Forrest clung to his heels. Colonel Streit's expedition was made up of 4 regiments of mounted infantry and 2 companies of cavalry, about 2,000 men in all. Rome, Georgia, an important point on the railroad from Chattanooga to Atlanta, was its objective point. The route to be traversed included a barren, mountainous tract of country, chosen from the fact that its sparse population was largely composed of Union sympathizers. But the road was likely to be so steep and rocky, and forage so scarce, that mules were chosen instead of horses for the mounts, on account of their being more sure-footed and needing less food. The expedition was sent by steamboat from Nashville, Tennessee, to Eastport, Alabama, which place was reached on the 19th of April, 1863. This movement was conducted with all possible secrecy, and was masked by an expedition under General Dodge at the head of a force of some 10,000 men. The unfortunate feature about the affair was the mules. On their arrival at Eastport, these animals, glad to get on solid land again, set up a bray that trumpeted the story of their arrival for miles around, and warned the cavalry of General Rodney, who had been skirmishing with General Dodge, that new foes were in the field. When night fell, some of Rodney's cavalry lads crept into the corral, and there, with yells and hoots and firing of guns and pistols, they stampeded nearly 400 of the mules. This caused a serious delay, only 200 of the mules being found after 2 days' search, while more time was lost in getting others. From Eastport the expedition proceeded to Tuscumbia, General Rodney stubbornly resisting the advance. Here a careful inspection was made, and all unfit men left out, so that about 1,500 picked men, splendidly armed and equipped, constituted the final raiding force. But the delay gave time for the news that some mysterious movement was afoot to spread far and wide, and Forrest led his corps of hard riders at top speed from Tennessee to the aid of Rodney in checking it. On the 27th he was in Dodge's front, helping Rodney to give him what trouble he could, though obliged to fall back before his much greater force. Streit was already on his way. He had set out at midnight of the 26th, in pouring rain and over muddy roads. At sunset of the next day he was 38 miles from the starting point. On the afternoon of the 28th the village of Moulton was reached without trace of an enemy in front or rear. The affair began to look promising. Next morning the Mule Brigade resumed its march, heading east towards Bluntsville. Not until the evening of the 28th did Forrest hear of this movement. Then word was brought him that a large body of Union troops had passed Mount Hope, riding eastward towards Moulton. The quick-witted leader guessed in a moment what all this meant, and with his native energy prepared for a sharp pursuit. In all haste he picked out a suitable force, had several days' rations cooked for the men and corn gathered for the horses, and shortly after midnight was on the road, leaving what men he could spare to keep Dodge busy and prevent pursuit. His command was 1,200 strong, the most of them veterans whose mettle had been tried on many a hard-fought field, and who were ready to follow their daring leader to the death, reckless and hardy irregulars brought up from childhood to the use of horses and arms, the sturdy sons of the back country. Streight was now in the ugly mountain country through which his route lay, and was advancing up Sand Mountain by a narrow, stony, winding road. He had 2 days the start of his pursuer, but with such headlong speed did Forrest ride that at dawn on the 30th, when the Federals were well up the mountain, the boom of a cannon gave them the startling notice that an enemy was in pursuit. Forrest had pushed onward at his usual killing pace, barely drawing rein until Streight's campfires came in sight, when his men laid down by their horses for a night's rest. Captain William Forrest, a brother of the general, had been sent ahead to reconnoitre, and in the early morning was advised of the near presence of the enemy by as awful a noise as human ears could well bear, the concentrated breakfast bray of 1,500 hungry mules. The cannon shot which had warned Colonel Streight that an enemy was near was followed by the yell of Captain Forrest's wild troopers as they charged hotly up the road. Their recklessness was to be severely punished, for as they came headlong onward a volley was poured into them from a ridge beside the road. Their shrewd opponent had formed an ambuscade, into which they blindly rode, with the result that Captain Forrest fell from his horse with a crushed thigh bone, and many of his men and horses were killed and wounded before they could get out of the trap into which they had ridden. The attack was followed up by Forrest's whole force. Edmondson's men, dismounted, advanced within 100 yards of the Federal line. Roddy and Julian rode recklessly forward in advance, and Forrest's escort and scouts occupied the left. It was a precipitous movement, which encountered a sudden and sharp reverse, nearly the whole line being met with a murderous fire and driven back. Then the Federals sprang forward in a fierce charge, driving the Confederates back in confusion over their own guns, 2 of which were captured with their caissons and ammunition. The loss of his guns threw Forrest into a violent rage, in which he made the air blue with his forcible opinions. Those guns must be taken back, he swore, at the risk of all their lives. He bade every man to dismount and tie their horses to saplings. There were to be no horse-holders in this emergency. Onward swept the avengers, but to their surprise and chagrin only a small rear guard was found, who fled on their mules after a few shots. Streight, with the captured guns, was well on the road again, and Forrest's men were obliged to go back, untie their horses, and get in marching order, losing nearly an hour of precious time. From this period onward the chase was largely a running fight. Forrest's orders to his men were to shoot at everything blue and keep up the scare. Streight's purpose was to make all haste forward to Rome, outriding his pursuers, and do what damage he could. But he had to deal with the rough riders of the Confederate army, men sure to keep on his track day and night, and give him no rest while a man on muleback remained. Forrest's persistence was soon shown. His advance troopers came up with the enemy again at Hogsback Ridge an hour before dark, and at once charged right and left. They had their own guns to face, Streight keeping up a hot fire with the captured pieces till the ammunition was exhausted, when, being short of horses, he spiked and abandoned the guns. The fight thus begun was kept up vigorously until 10 o'clock, and was as gallant and stubbornly contested as any of the minor engagements of the war, the echoes of that mountain desert repeating most unwonted sounds. General Forrest seemed everywhere, and so fearlessly exposed himself that 1 horse was killed and 2 were wounded under him, though he escaped unhurt. In the end Colonel Streight was taught that he could not drive off his persistent foe, and took to the road again, but twice more during the night he was attacked, each time repelling his foes by an ambuscade. About 10 o'clock the next morning Bluntsville was reached. The Federals were now clear of the mountains, and in an open and fertile country where food and horses were to be had. Both were needed. Many of the mules had given out, leaving their riders on foot, while mules and men alike were short of food. It was the 1st of May, and the village was well filled with country people, who saw with dismay the Yankee troopers riding in and confiscating all the horses on which they could lay hands. Streight now decided to get on with pack mules, and the wagons were bunched and set on fire, the command leaving them burning as it moved on. They did not burn long. Forrest's advance came on with a yell, swept the Federal rear guard from the village, and made all haste to extinguish the flames, the wagons furnishing them with a rich and much-needed supply. Few horses or mules, however, were to be had, as Streight's men had swept the country as far as they could reach on both sides of the road. On went the raiders, and on came their pursuers, heading east, keeping in close touch, and skirmishing briskly as they went, for 10 miles more. This brought them to a branch of the Black Warrior River. The ford reached by the Federals was rocky, and they had their foe close in the rear, but by an active use of skirmishers and of his 2 howitzers, Streight managed to get his command across and to hold the ford until a brief rest was taken. The Yankee troopers were not long on the road again before Forrest was over the stream, and the hot chase was on once more. The night that followed was the 4th night of the chase, which had been kept up with only brief snatches of rest and with an almost incessant contest. On the morning of the 2nd the skirmishing briskly began again, Forrest with an advance troop attacking the Federal rear guard, and fighting almost without intermission during the 15 miles' ride to Black Creek. Here was a deep and sluggish stream walled in with very high banks. It was spanned at the road by a wooden bridge, over which Colonel Streight rushed his force at top speed, and at once set the bridge on fire, facing about with his howitzers to check pursuit. One man was left on the wrong side of the stream, and was captured by Forrest himself as he dashed up to the blazing bridge at the head of his men. Colonel Streight might now reasonably believe that he had baffled his foe for a time, and might safely take the repose so greatly needed. The stream was said to be too deep to ford, and the nearest bridge, 2 miles away, was a mere wreck, impassable for horses. Forrest was in a quandary as to how he should get over that sluggish but deep ditch, and stood looking at it in dismay. He was obliged to wait in any event, for his artillery and the bulk of his command had been far outridden. In this dilemma the problem was solved for him by a country girl who lived near by, Emma Sanson by name. Near the burning bridge was a little 1-storied 4-roomed house in which dwelt the widow Sanson and her 2 daughters. She had 2 sons in the service, and the 3 women, like many in similar circumstances in the Confederacy, were living as best they could. The girl Emma watched with deep interest the rapid flight, the burning of the bridge, and the headlong pursuit of the Confederate troop. Seeing Forrest looking with a dubious countenance at the dark stream, she came up and accosted him. "You are after those Yankees?" she asked. "I should think so," said Forrest, "and would give my best hat to get across this ugly ditch." "I think you can do it," she replied. "Aha, my good girl, that is news worth more than my old hat. How is it to be done? Let me know at once." "I know a place near our farm where I have often seen cows wade across when the water was low. If you will lend me a horse to put my saddle on, I will show you the place." "There's no time for that. Get up behind me," cried Forrest. In a second's time the alert girl was on the horse behind. As they were about to ride off, her mother came out and asked, in a frightened tone, where she was going. Forrest explained and promised to bring her back safe, and in a moment more was off. The ride was not a long one, the place sought being soon reached. Here the general and his guide quickly dismounted, the girl leading down a ravine to the water's edge, where Forrest examined the depth and satisfied himself that the place might prove fordable. Mounting again, they rode back, now under fire, for a sharp engagement was going on across the creek between the Confederates and the Federal rear guard. Forrest was profuse in his thanks as he left the quick-witted girl at her home. He gave her, as a reward, a horse, and also wrote her a note of thanks, and asked her to send him a lock of her hair, which he would be glad to have and cherish in memory of her service to the cause. The Lost Ford, as the place has since been called, proved available, the horses finding foothold, while the ammunition was taken from the caissons and carried across by the horsemen. This done, the guns and empty caissons were pulled across by ropes, and soon all was in readiness to take up the chase again. Colonel Streight had reached Gadsden, 4 miles away, when to his surprise and dismay he heard once more the shots of his indefatigable foemen as they rode up at full speed. It seemed as if nothing could stop the sleuth hounds on his track. For the succeeding 15 miles there was a continual skirmish, and when Streight halted to rest, the fight became so sharp that his weary men were forced to take to the road again. Rest was not for them, with Forrest in their rear. Streight here tried for the last time his plan of ambuscading his enemy, but the wide-awake Forrest was not to be taken in as before, and by a flank movement compelled the weary Federals to resume their march. All that night they rode despondently on, crossing the Chattanooga River on a bridge which they burned behind them, and by sunrise reaching Cedar Bluff, 28 miles from Gadsden. At 9 o'clock they stopped to feed, and the worn-out men had no sooner touched the ground than they were dead asleep. Forrest had taken the opportunity to give his men a night's rest, detaching 200 of them to follow the Federals and devil them all night. Streight had also detached 200 of his best mounted men, bidding them to march to Rome and hold the bridge at that place. But Forrest had shrewdly sent a fast rider to the same place, and when Russell got up he found the bridge strongly held, and his enterprise hopeless. When May 3rd dawned, the hot chase was near its end. Forrest had given his men 10 hours' sleep, while Streight's worn-out men were plodding desperately on. This all-night's ride was a fatal error for the Federals, and was a main cause of their final defeat. The short distance they had made was covered by Forrest's men, fresh from their night's sleep, in a few hours, and at 9:30, while the Federals were at breakfast, the old teasing rattle of small arms called them into line again. About the same time word came from Russell that he could not take the bridge at Rome, and news was received that a flanking movement of Confederates had cut in between Rome and the Yankee troopers. The affair now looked utterly desperate, but the brave Streight rallied his men on a ridge in a field, and skirmishing began. So utterly exhausted, however, were the Federals, that many of them went to sleep as they lay in line of battle behind the ridge, while looking along their gun barrels with finger on trigger. The game was fairly up. Forrest sent in a flag of truce with a demand for surrender. Streight asked for an interview, which was readily granted. "What terms do you offer?" asked Streight. "Immediate surrender. Your men to be treated as prisoners of war, officers to retain their side arms and personal property." During the conversation Streight asked, "How many men have you?" "Enough here to run over you, and a column of fresh troops between you and Rome." In reality, Forrest had only 500 men left him, the remainder having been dropped from point to point as their horses gave out, and no new mounts were to be had. But the 500 made noise enough for a brigade, it being Forrest's purpose to conceal the weakness of his force. As they talked, a section of the artillery of the pursuers came in sight within a short range. Colonel Streight objected to this, and Forrest gave orders that the guns must come no nearer. But the artillerymen moved around a neighboring hill, as if putting several small batteries into position. "Have you many guns, General?" asked Streight. "Enough to blow you all to pieces before an hour," was the grandiloquent reply. Colonel Streight looked doubtfully at the situation, not knowing how much to believe of what he saw and heard. After some more words he said, "I cannot decide without consulting my officers." "As you please," said Forrest, with a sublime air of indifference. "It will soon be over, one way or another." Streight had not all the fight taken out of him yet, but he found all his officers in favor of a surrender, and felt obliged to consent. The men accordingly were bidden to stack their arms, and were marched back into a field, Forrest managing, as soon as he conveniently could, to get his men between them and their guns. The officers were started without delay, and under a strong escort, for Rome, 20 miles away. On their route thither they met Captain Russell, returning, and told him of what had taken place. With tears in his eyes he surrendered his 200 men. Thus ended one of the most striking achievements of the Civil War. Forrest's relentless and indefatigable pursuit, his prompt overcoming of the difficulties of the way, and his final capture of Streight's men with less than half their force, have been commended by military critics as his most brilliant achievement and one of the most remarkable exploits in the annals of warfare. The outcome of Colonel Streight's raid to the south was singularly like that of General Morgan's famous raid to the north. Morgan's capture, imprisonment, and escape were paralleled in Streight's career. Sent to Richmond, and immured in Libby prison, he and 4 of his officers took part in the memorable escape by a tunnel route in February, 1864. In his report, published after his escape, he blames his defeat largely on the poor mules, and claims that Forrest's force outnumbered him 3 to 1. It is not unlikely that he believed this, judging from the incessant trouble they had given him, but the truth seems established that at the surrender Forrest had less than half the available force of his foe. End of chapter 28.
Chapter 29 of Historical Tales, Volume 2, American 2. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Historical Tales, Volume 2, American 2, by Charles Morris. Chapter 29, Exploits of a Blockade Runner. There were no more daring adventures and hair-breadth escapes during the Civil War than those encountered in running the blockade, carrying sadly needed supplies into the ports of the Confederacy and returning with cargoes of cotton and other valuable products of the South. There was money in it for the successful, much money. But on the other hand there was danger of loss of vessel and cargo, long imprisonment, perhaps death, and only men of unusual boldness and dare-devil recklessness were ready to engage in it. The stories told by blockade runners are full of instances of desperate risk and thrilling adventure. As an example of their more ordinary experience, we shall give from Thomas E. Taylor's Running the Blockade the interesting account of his first run to Wilmington Harbor. This town, it must be premised, lies some 16 miles up Cape Fear River, at whose principal entrance the formidable Fort Fisher obliged the blockading fleet to lie out of the range of its guns, and thus gave some opportunity for alert blockade runners to slip in. Yet this was far from safe and easy. Each entrance to the river was surrounded by an inshore squadron of Federal vessels, anchored in close order during the day, and at night weighing anchor and patrolling from shore to shore. Farther out was a second cordon of cruisers, similarly alert, and beyond these again gunboats were stationed at intervals, far enough out to sight by daybreak any vessels that crossed Wilmington Bar at high tide in the night. Then, again, there were free cruisers patrolling the Gulf Stream, so that to enter the river unseen was about as difficult as any naval operation could well be. With this preliminary statement of the situation, let us permit Mr. Taylor to tell his story. The Banshee's engines proved so unsatisfactory that under ordinary conditions 9 or 10 knots was all we could get out of her. She was therefore not permitted to run any avoidable risks, and to this I attribute her extraordinary success where better boats failed. As long as daylight lasted a man was never out of the cross trees, and the moment a sail was seen the Banshee's stern was turned to it till it was dropped below the horizon. The lookout man, to quicken his eyes, had $1 for every sail he sighted, and if it were seen from the deck first he was fined 5. This may appear excessive, but the importance in blockade running of seeing before you are seen is too great for any chance to be neglected, and it must be remembered that the pay of ordinary seamen for each round trip in and out was from £50 to £60. Following these tactics, we crept noiselessly along the shores of the Bahamas, invisible in the darkness, and ran on unmolested for the first 2 days out from the port of Nassau, though our course was often interfered with by the necessity of avoiding hostile vessels. Then came the anxious moment on the 3rd, when, her position having been taken at noon to see if she was near enough to run under the guns of Fort Fisher before the following daybreak, it was found there was just time, but none to spare for accidents or delay. Still, the danger of lying out another day so close to the blockaded port was very great, and rather than risk it, we resolved to keep straight on our course and chance being overtaken by daylight before we were under the fort. Now the real excitement began, and nothing I have ever experienced can compare with it. Hunting, pig-sticking, steeple-chasing, big-game shooting, polo, I have done a little of each. All have their thrilling moments, but none can approach running a blockade. And perhaps my readers may sympathize with my enthusiasm when they consider the dangers to be encountered, after 3 days of constant anxiety and little sleep, in threading our way through a swarm of blockaders, and the accuracy required to hit in the nick of time the mouth of a river only a half-mile wide, without lights, and with a coastline so low and featureless that, as a rule, the first intimation we had of its nearness was the dim white line of the surf. There were, of course, many different plans of getting in, but at this time the favourite dodge was to run up some 15 or 20 miles to the north of Cape Fear, so as to round the northernmost of the blockaders, instead of dashing right through the inner squadron; then to creep down close to the surf till the river was reached; and this was the course the Banshee intended to adopt. We steamed cautiously on until nightfall. The night proved dark, but dangerously clear and calm. No lights were allowed, not even a cigar. The engine-room hatchways were covered with tarpaulins, at the risk of suffocating the unfortunate engineers and stokers in the almost insufferable atmosphere below. But it was absolutely imperative that not a glimmer of light should appear. Even the binnacle was covered, and the steersman had to see as much of the compass as he could through a conical aperture carried almost up to his eyes. With everything thus in readiness, we steamed on in silence except for the stroke of the engines and the beat of the paddle floats, which in the calm of the night seemed distressingly loud. All hands were on deck, crouching behind the bulwarks, and we on the bridge, namely the captain, the pilot, and I, were straining our eyes into the darkness. Presently Burrows made an uneasy movement. "Better get a cast of the lead, Captain," I heard him whisper. A muttered order down the engine-room tube was Steele's reply, and the Banshee slowed and then stopped. It was an anxious moment while a dim figure stole into the forechains, for there is always a danger of steam blowing off when engines are unexpectedly stopped, and that would have been enough to betray our presence for miles around. In a minute or two came back the report, 16 fathoms, sandy bottom with black specks. "We are not in as far as I thought, Captain," said Burrows, "and we are too far to the southward. Port 2 points, and go a little faster." As he explained, we must be well to the north of the speckled bottom before it was safe to head for the shore, and away we went again. In about an hour Burrows quietly asked for another sounding. Again she was gently stopped, and this time he was satisfied. "Starboard and go ahead easy," was the order now, and as we crept in not a sound was heard but that of the regular beat of the paddle floats, still dangerously loud in spite of our snail's pace. Suddenly Burrows gripped my arm. "There's one of 'em, Mr. Taylor," he whispered, "on the starboard bow." In vain I strained my eyes to where he pointed. Not a thing could I see. But presently I heard Steele say beneath his breath, "All right, Burrows, I see her. Starboard a little, steady," was the order passed aft. A moment afterward I could make out a long, low, black object on our starboard side, lying perfectly still. Would she see us? That was the question. But no, though we passed within 100 yards of her, we were not discovered, and I breathed again. Not very long after we had dropped her, Burrows whispered, "Steamer on the port bow," and another cruiser was made out close to us. "Hard a port," said Steele, and round she swung, bringing our friend upon our beam. Still unobserved, we crept quietly on, when all at once a third cruiser shaped itself out of the gloom right ahead, and steaming slowly across our bows. "Stop her," said Steele in a moment, and as we lay like dead, our enemy went on and disappeared in the darkness. It was clear there was a false reckoning somewhere, and that instead of rounding the head of the blockading line we were passing through the very centre of it. However, Burrows was now of opinion that we must be inside the squadron, and advocated making the land. So slow ahead we went, until the low-lying coast and the surf line became dimly visible. Still, we could not tell where we were, and as time was getting on, alarmingly near dawn, the only thing to do was to creep down along the surf as close in and as fast as we dared. It was a great relief when we suddenly heard Burrows say, "It's all right, I see the big hill." The big hill was a hillock about as high as a full-grown oak, but it was the most prominent feature for miles on that dreary coast, and served to tell us exactly how far we were from Fort Fisher. And fortunate it was for us we were so near. Daylight was already breaking, and before we were opposite the fort we could make out 6 or 7 gunboats, which steamed rapidly toward us and angrily opened fire. Their shots were soon dropping close around us, an unpleasant sensation when you know you have several tons of gunpowder under your feet. To make matters worse, the north breaker shoal now compelled us to haul off the shore and steam farther out. It began to look ugly for us, when all at once there was a flash from the shore, followed by a sound that came like music to our ears, that of a shell whirring over our heads. It was Fort Fisher, wide awake, and warning the gunboats to keep their distance. With a parting broadside they steamed sulkily out of range, and in half an hour we were safely over the bar. A boat put off from the fort, and then, well, it was the days of champagne cocktails, not whiskey and sodas, and one did not run a blockade every day. For my part, I was mightily proud of my first attempt and my baptism of fire. Blockade running seemed the pleasantest and most exhilarating of pastimes. I did not know then what a very serious business it could be. On the return trip the Banshee was ballasted with tobacco and laden with cotton, 3 tiers of it even on deck. She ran impudently straight through the centre of the cordon, close by the flagship, and got through the second cordon in safety, though chased by a gunboat. When Nassau was reached, and profits summed up, they proved to amount to £50 a ton on the war material carried in, while the tobacco carried out netted £70 a ton for 100 tons, and the cotton £50 a bale for 500 bales. It may be seen that successful blockade running paid. It may be of interest to our readers to give some other adventures in which the Banshee figured. On one of her trips, when she was creeping down the land about 12 miles above Fort Fisher, a cruiser appeared moving along about 200 yards from shore. An effort was made to pass her inside, hoping to be hidden by the dark background of the land. But there were eyes open on the cruiser, and there came the ominous hail, "Stop that steamer, or I will sink you!" "We haven't time to stop," growled Steele, and shouted down the engine-room tube to pile on the coals. There was nothing now but to run and hope for luck. The cruiser at once opened fire, and as the Banshee began to draw ahead, a shot carried away her foremast, and a shell exploded in her bunkers. Grape and canister followed, the crew escaping death by flinging themselves flat on the deck. Even the steersman, stricken by panic, did the same, and the boat swerved round and headed straight for the surf. A close shave it was as Taylor rushed aft, clutched the wheel, and just in time got her head off the land. Before they got in, 2 other cruisers brought them under fire, but they ran under Fort Fisher in safety. One more adventure of the Banshee, and we shall close. It was on her 6th trip out. She had got safely through the fleet, and day had dawned. All was joy and relaxation, when Erskine, the engineer, suddenly exclaimed, "Mr. Taylor, look astern!" And there, not 4 miles away, and coming down under sail and steam, was a large side-wheel steamer, left unseen by gross carelessness on the part of the lookout. Erskine rushed below, and soon volumes of smoke were pouring from the funnels, but it was almost too late, for the chaser was coming up so fast that the uniformed officers on her bridge could be distinctly seen. "This will never do," said Steele, and ordered the helm to be altered so as to bring the ship up to the wind. It took them off the course to Nassau, but it forced their pursuer to take in her sails, and an exciting chase under steam right into the wind's eye began. Matters at length became so critical that no hope remained but to lighten the boat by throwing overboard her deck-load of cotton, a sore necessity in view of the fact that the bales which went bobbing about on the waves were worth to them £50 or £60 apiece. In clearing out the bales they cleared out something more, a runaway slave, who had been standing wedged between 2 bales for at least 48 hours. He received an ovation on landing at Nassau, but they were obliged to pay $4,000 to his owner on their return to Wilmington. The loss of the cotton lightened the boat, and it began to gain in the race, both craft plunging into the great seas that had arisen, yet neither slackening speed. A fresh danger arose when the bearings of the engine became overheated from the enormous strain put upon them. It was necessary to stop, despite the imminence of the chase, and to loosen the bearings and feed them liberally with salad oil mixed with gunpowder before they were in working order again. Thus 15 weary hours passed away, and nightfall was at hand, when the chaser, then only 5 miles astern, turned and gave up the pursuit. It was learned afterward that her stokers were dead beat. But port was still far away, they having been chased 150 miles out of their course, and fuel was getting perilously low. At the end of the 3rd day the last coal was used, and then everything that would burn was shoved into the furnaces, mainmast, bulwarks, deck cabin, with cotton and turpentine to aid, and these only sufficed to carry them into Bahama Island, still 60 miles from Nassau. They were not there 2 hours before they saw a Federal steamer glide slowly past, eyeing them as the fox eyed the grapes. The adventure was still not at its end. Mr. Taylor hired a schooner in the harbor to go to Nassau and bring back a cargo of coal, he and Murray Ainsley, a passenger, going in it. But the night proved a terrible one, a hurricane rising, and the crew growing so terrified by the fury of the gale and the vividness of the lightning that they nearly wrecked the schooner on the rocks. When the weather moderated, the men refused to proceed, and it was only by a dint of show of revolvers and promise of reward that Taylor and his passenger induced them to go on. On reaching Nassau they were utterly worn out, having been almost without sleep for a week, while Taylor's feet were so swollen that his boots had to be cut off. Thus ended one of the most notable chases in the history of blockade running, it having lasted 15 hours and covered nearly 200 miles. Fortunate was it for the Banshee that the James Adger, her pursuer, had no bow chasers, and that the weather was too ugly for her to venture to yaw and use her broadside guns, or the Banshee might have there and then ended her career. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of Historical Tales, Volume 2, American 2. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Historical Tales, Volume 2, American 2, by Charles Morris. Chapter 30. Fontaine, the Scout, and the Besiegers of Vicksburg. The Civil War was not lacking in its daring and interesting adventures of scouts, spies, dispatch-bearers, and others of that interesting tribe whose field of operations lies between the armies in the field, and whose game is played with life as the stake, this being fair prey for the bullet if pursued, and often for the rope if captured. We have the story of one of these heroes of hazard to tell, a story the more interesting from the fact that he was a cripple who seemed fit only to hobble about his home. It is the remarkable feat of Lamar Fontaine, a Confederate dispatch-bearer, which the record of the war has nothing to surpass. Fontaine's disability came from a broken leg, which had left him so disabled that he could not take a step without a crutch, and in mounting a horse he was obliged to lift the useless leg over the saddle with his right hand. But once in the saddle he was as good a man as his fellow, and his dexterity with the pistol rendered him a dangerous fellow to face when it became a question of life or death. We must seek him at that period in 1863, when the stronghold of Vicksburg, on which depended the Confederacy's control of the Mississippi, was closely invested by the army of General Grant, the siege lines so continuous, alike in the rear of the town and on the Mississippi and its opposite shore, that it seemed as if hardly a bird could enter or leave its streets. General Johnston kept the field in the rear, but Grant was much too strong for him, and he was obliged to trust the chapter of chances for the hope of setting Pemberton free from the net by which he was surrounded. Knowing the daring and usual success of Lamar Fontaine in very hazardous enterprises, Johnston engaged him to endeavor to carry a verbal message to General Pemberton, sending him out on the perilous and seemingly impossible venture of making his way into the closely beleaguered city. In addition to his message, he took with him a supply of some 40 pounds of percussion caps for the use of the besieged garrison. On the 24th of May, 1863, Fontaine set out from his father's home at a considerable distance in the rear of the Federal lines. He was well mounted and armed with an excellent revolver and a good sabre, which he carried in a wooden scabbard to prevent its rattling. His other burdens were his packet of percussion caps, his blanket, and his crutches. That night he crossed Big Black River, and before dawn of the next day was well within the lines of the enemy. Travel by day was now out of the question, so he hid his horse in a ravine, and found a place of shelter for himself in a fallen tree that overlooked the road. From his hiding place he saw a confused and hasty movement of the enemy, seemingly in retreat from too hot a brush with the garrison. Waiting till their columns had passed and the nightfall made it safe for him to move, he mounted again and continued his journey in the direction of Snyder's Bluff on the Yazoo. Entering the telegraphic road from the Yazoo City to Vicksburg, he had not gone far before he was confronted and hailed by a picket of the enemy. Spurring his spirited steed, he dashed past at full speed. A volley followed him, one of the balls striking his horse, though none of them touched him. The good steed had received a mortal wound, but by a final and desperate effort it carried its rider to the banks of the Yazoo River. Here it fell dead, leaving its late rider afoot, and lacking one of his crutches, which had been caught and jerked away by the limb of a tree as he dashed headlong past. With the aid of his remaining crutch, and carrying his baggage, Fontaine groped his way along the river side, keenly looking for some means of conveyance on its waters. He soon found what he wanted in the shape of a small log canoe, tied to a tree on the river bank. Pressing this into his service, and disposing himself and his burden safely within, he paddled down the stream, hoping to reach the Mississippi and drift down to the city front before break of day. Success was not to come so easily. A sound of puffing steam came from down the river, and soon a trio of gunboats loomed through the gloom, heading towards Yazoo City. These were avoided by taking shelter among a bunch of willows that overhung the bank, and served to hide the boat from view. The gunboats well passed, Fontaine took to the current again, soon reaching Snyder's Bluff, which was lighted up and a scene of animation. Whites and blacks mingled on the bank, and it looked like a midnight ball between the Yankee soldiers and belles of sable hue. Gunboats and barges lined the shore, and the light was thrown far out over the stream. But those present were too hilarious to be watchful, and lying flat in his canoe, the scout glided safely past, the dug-out not distinguishable from a piece of driftwood. Before the new day dawned he reached the backwater of the Mississippi, but in the darkness he missed the outlet of the Yazoo and paddled into what is called Old River. The new day reddened in the east while he was still vainly searching for an opening into the broad parent stream. Then his familiarity with the locality showed him his mistake, and he was forced to seek a hiding place for himself and his boat. He had now been out 2 days and nights. The little food he brought had long been devoured, and hunger was assailing him. Sleep had also scarcely visited his eyes, and the strain was growing severe. Getting some slumber that day in his covert, he set out again as soon as night fell, paddling back into the Yazoo, from which he soon reached the Mississippi. He was here on a well-peopled stream, boats and lights being abundant. As he glided on through the gloom he passed 40 or 50 transports, but had the good fortune to be seen by only one man, who hailed him from the stern of a steamer and asked him where he was going. "To look after my fishing lines," he replied. "All right. Hope you'll have a good catch," and he floated on. Farther down in the bend of the stream above Vicksburg, he came upon a more animated scene. Here were the mortar boats in full blast, bombarding the city, every shot lighting up the stream for a wide space around. But the gun crews were too busy to pay any attention to the seeming drift log that glided silently by the fleet, or to notice the man that lay at full length within it. On he went, trusting to the current and keeping his recumbent position. The next day's dawn found him in the midst of the Confederate picket boats in front of the city. Here, tying a white handkerchief to his paddle, he lifted it as a flag of truce, and sat up with a loud hurrah for Jeff Davis and the Confederacy. As may well be imagined, his cheers were echoed by the boatmen when they learned his mission, and he was borne in triumph ashore and taken to General Pemberton's headquarters. He received a warm welcome from the General, alike for the message he brought and the very desirable supply of percussion caps. It was with no little admiration that Pemberton heard the story of a daring feat that seemed utterly impossible for a cripple on crutches. During the next day the scout wandered about the beleaguered city, viewing the animated and in many respects terrible scene of warfare which it presented, the fierce bombardment from the Federal works extending in a long curve from the river above to the river below the city, the hot return fire of the defendants, the equally fierce exchange of fire between the gunboats and mortars and the entrenchments on the bluffs, the bursting of shells in the city streets, the ruined habitations, and the cave-like refuges in which the citizens sought safety from the death-dealing missiles. It was a scene never to be forgotten, a spectacle of ruin, suffering, and death. And the suffering was not alone from the terrible enginery of war, but from lack of food as well, for that dread spectre of famine, that in a few weeks more was to force the surrender of the valiantly defended city, was already showing its gaunt form in the desolated streets and the foodless homes. Fontaine was glad enough after his day and night among the besieged to seek again the more open field of operations outside. Receiving a dispatch from General Pemberton to his colleague in the field, and a suitable reward for his service, he betook himself again to the canoe which had stood him in such good stead, and resumed his task of danger. He was on a well-guarded river, and had to pass through a country full of foes, and the peril of his enterprise was by no means at an end. The gloom of evening lay on the stream when he once more trusted himself to the swift current, which quickly brought him among the craft of the enemy below the city. Avoiding their picket boats on both sides of the river, he floated near the gunboats as safer, passing so near one of them that through an open porthole he could see a group of men playing cards, and hear their conversation. He made a landing at length at Diamond Place, bidding adieu to his faithful dug-out, and gladly setting foot on land again. Hobbling with the aid of his crutch through the bottom lands, the scout soon reached higher ground, and here made his way to the house of an acquaintance, hoping to find a mount. But all the useful horses and mules on the place had been confiscated by the foe. There remained only a worthless old gelding and a half-broken colt, of which he was offered the choice. He took the colt, but found it to travel so badly that he wished he had chosen the gelding. In this dilemma fortune favoured him, for in the bottom he came upon a fine horse, tied by a blind bridle and without a saddle. A basket and an old bag were lying close by, and he inferred from this that a negro had left the horse, and that a camp of the enemy was near at hand. Here was an opportunity for confiscation of which he did not hesitate to avail himself, and in all haste he exchanged bridles, saddled the horse, turned loose the colt, mounted, and was off. He took a course so as to avoid the supposed camp, but had not gone far before he came face to face with a Federal soldier, who was evidently returning from a successful foray for plunder, for he was well laden with chickens and carrying a bucket of honey. He began questioning Fontaine with a curiosity that threatened unpleasant consequences, and the alert scout ended the colloquy with a pistol belt which struck the plunderer squarely in the forehead. Leaving him stretched on the path with his poultry and honey beside him, Fontaine made all haste from that dangerous locality. Reaching a settlement at a distance from the stream, he hired a guide to lead him to Hankerson's ferry on the Big Black River, promising him $50 if he would take him there without following any road. They proceeded till near the ferry, when Fontaine sent his guide ahead to learn if any of the enemy were in that vicinity. But there was something about the manner and talk of the man that excited his suspicion, and as soon as the fellow was gone, he sought a hiding place from which he could watch his return. The man was gone much longer than appeared necessary. At length he came back alone, and reported that the track was clear, there being no Yankees near the ferry. Paying and dismissing the guide without showing his suspicions, Fontaine took good care not to obey his directions, but selected his course so as to approach the river at a point above the ferry. By doing so he escaped a squad of soldiers that seemed posted to intercept him, for as he entered the road near the river bank, a sentinel rose not more than 10 feet away and bade him to halt. He seemed to form the right flank of a line of sentinels posted to command the ferry. It was a time for quick and decisive action. Fontaine had approached, pistol in hand, and as the man hailed, he felled him with a bullet, then wheeled his horse and set out at full gallop up the stream. A shower of balls followed him, one of them striking his right hand and wounding all 4 of its fingers. Another grazed his right leg, and a third cut a hole through his sword scabbard. The horse fared worse, for no fewer than 7 bullets struck it. Reeling from its wounds, it still had strength to bear up for a mile, when it fell and died. He had outridden his foes, who were all on foot, and dividing his arms and clothes into 2 packages, he trusted himself to the waters of the Big Black, which he swam in safety. On the other side he was in friendly territory, and did not walk far before he came to the house of a patriotic Southern woman, who loaned him the only horse she had. It was a stray one, which had come to her place after the Yankee foragers had carried off all the horses she owned. Fontaine was now in a safe region. His borrowed horse carried him to Raymond by 2 o'clock the next morning, and was here changed for a fresh one, which enabled him to reach Jackson during the forenoon. Here he delivered his dispatch to General Johnston, having successfully performed a feat which, in view of its difficulties and his physical disability, may well be classed as phenomenal. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of Historical Tales, Volume 2, American 2. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Historical Tales, Volume 2, American 2, by Charles Morris. Chapter 31. Gordon and the Bayonet Charge at Antietam. In the opening chapter of General John B. Gordon's interesting Reminiscences of the Civil War, he tells us that the bayonet, so far as he knew, was very rarely used in that war, and never effectively. The bayonet, the lineal descendant of the lance and spear of far past warfare, had done remarkable service in its day, but with the advent of the modern rifle its day ended, except as a weapon useful in repelling cavalry charges or defending hollow squares. Fearful as their glittering and bristling points appeared when levelled in front of a charging line, bayonets were rarely reddened with the blood of an enemy in the Civil War, and the soldiers of that desperate conflict found them more useful as tools in the rapid throwing up of light earthworks than as weapons for use against their foes. Later in his work, Gordon gives a case in point in his vivid description of a bayonet charge upon the line under his command on the bloody field of Antietam. This is well worth repeating as an illustration of the modern ineffectiveness of the bayonet, and also as a story of thrilling interest in itself. As related by Gordon, there are few incidents in the war which surpass it in picturesqueness and vitality. The battle of Antietam was a struggle unsurpassed for its desperate and deadly fierceness in the whole war, the losses, in comparison with the numbers engaged, being the greatest of any battlefield of the conflict. The plain in which it was fought was literally bathed in blood. It is not our purpose to describe this battle, but simply that portion of it in which General Gordon's troops were engaged. For hour after hour a desperate struggle continued on the left of Lee's lines, in which charge and countercharge succeeded each other, until the green corn which had waved there looked as if it had been showered upon by a rain of blood. But during those hours of death not a shot had been fired upon the centre. Here General Gordon's men held the most advanced position, and were without a supporting line, their post being one of imminent danger in case of an assault in force. As the day passed onward, the battle on the left at length lulled, both sides glad of an interval of rest. That McClellan's next attempt would be made upon the centre General Lee felt confident, and he rode thither to caution the leaders and bid them to hold their ground at any sacrifice. A break at that point, he told them, might prove ruinous to the army. He especially charged Gordon to stand stiffly with his men, as his small force would feel the first brunt of the expected assault. Gordon, alike to give hope to Lee and to inspire his own men, said in reply, "These men are going to stay here, General, till the sun goes down or victory is won." Lee's military judgment, as usual, was correct. He had hardly got back to the left of his line when the assault predicted by him came. It was a beautiful and brilliant day, scarcely a cloud mantling the sky. Down the slope opposite marched through the clear sunlight a powerful column of Federal troops. Crossing the little Antietam Creek, they formed in column of assault, 4 lines deep. Their commander, nobly mounted, placed himself at their right, while the front line came to a charge bayonets, and the other lines to a right shoulder shift. In the rear front, the band blared out martial music to give inspiration to the men. To the Confederates, looking silently and expectantly on the coming corps, the scene was one of thrilling interest. It might have been one of terror but for their long training in such sights. Who were these men so spick and span in their fresh blue uniforms, in strange contrast to the ragged and soiled Confederate gray? Every man of them wore white gaiters and neat attire, while the dust and smoke of battle had surely never touched the banners that floated above their heads. Were they new recruits from some military camp, now first to test their training in actual war? In the sunlight the long line of bayonets gleamed like burnished silver. As if fresh from the parade ground they advanced with perfect alignment, their steps keeping martial time to the steady beat of the drum. It was a magnificent spectacle as the line advanced, a show of martial beauty which it seemed a shame to destroy by the rude hand of war. One thing was evident to General Gordon. His opponent proposed to trust to the bayonet, and attempt to break through Lee's center by the sheer weight of his deep charging column. It might be done. Here were 4 lines of blue marching on the one in gray. How should the charge be met? By immediate and steady fire, or by withholding his fire till the lines were face to face, and then pouring upon the Federals a blighting storm of lead? Gordon decided on the latter, believing that a sudden and withering burst of deadly hail in the faces of men with empty guns would be more than any troops could stand. All the horses were sent to the rear, and the men were ordered to lie down in the grass, they being told by their officers that the Federals were coming with unloaded guns, trusting to the bayonet, and that not a shot must be heard until the word fire was given. This would not be until the Federals were close at hand. In the old Revolutionary phrase, they must wait till they saw the whites of their eyes. On came the long lines, still as steady and precise in movement as if upon holiday drill. Not a rifle shot was heard. Neither side had artillery at this point, and no roar of cannon broke the strange silence. The awaiting boys in gray grew eager and impatient, and had to be kept in restraint by their officers. "Wait, wait for the word," was the admonition. Yet it was hard to lie there while that line of bayonets came closer and closer, until the eagles on the buttons of the blue coats could be seen, and at length the front rank was not 20 yards away. The time had come. With all the power of his lungs, Gordon shouted out the word, "Fire!" In an instant there burst from the prostrate line a blinding blaze of light, and a frightful hail of bullets rent through the Federal ranks. Terrible was the effect of that consuming volley. Almost the whole front rank of the foe seemed to go down in a mass. The brave commander and his horse fell in a heap together. In a moment he was on his feet. It was the horse, not the man, that the deadly bullet had found. In an instant more the recumbent Confederates were on their feet, an appalling yell bursting from their throats as they poured new volleys upon the Federal lines. No troops on earth could have faced that fire without a chance to reply. Their foes bore unloaded guns. Not a bayonet had reached the breast for which it was aimed. The lines recoiled, though in good order for men swept by such a blast of death. Large numbers of them had fallen, yet not a drop of blood had been lost by one of Gordon's men. The gallant man who led the Federals was not yet satisfied that the bayonet could not break the ranks of his foes. Reforming his men, now in 3 lines, he led them again with empty guns to the charge. Again they were driven back with heavy loss. With extraordinary persistence he clung to his plan of winning with the bayonet, coming on again and again until 4 fruitless charges had been made on Gordon's lines, not a man in which had fallen, while the Federal loss had been very heavy. Not until convinced by this sanguinary evidence that the day of the bayonet was past, did he order his men to load and open fire on the hostile lines. It was an experiment in an obsolete method of warfare which had proved disastrous to those engaged in it. In the remaining hours of that desperate conflict, Gordon and his men had another experience to face. The fire from both sides grew furious and deadly, and at nightfall, when the carnage ceased, so many of the soldiers in gray had fallen, that, as one of the officers afterwards said, he could have walked on the dead bodies of the men from end to end of the line. How true this was Gordon was unable to say, for by this time he was himself a wreck, fairly riddled with bullets. As he tells us, his previous record was remarkably reversed in this fight, and we cannot better close our story than with a description of his new experience. He had hitherto seemed almost to bear a charmed life. While numbers had fallen by his side in battle, and his own clothing had often been pierced and torn by balls and fragments of shells, he had not lost a drop of blood, and his men looked upon him as one destined by fate not to be killed in battle. "They can't hit him. He's as safe in one place as another," form a type of the expressions used by them, and Gordon grew to have much the same faith in his destiny as he passed through battle after battle unharmed. At Antietam the record was decidedly broken. The first volley from the Federal troops sent a bullet whirling through the calf of his right leg. Soon after, another ball went through the same leg at a higher point. As no bone was broken, he was still able to walk along the line and encourage his men to bear the deadly fire which was sweeping their lines. Later in the day a third ball came, this passing through his arm, rending flesh and tendons, but still breaking no bone. Through his shoulder soon came a fourth ball, carrying a wad of clothing into the wound. The men begged their bleeding commander to leave the field, but he would not flinch, though fast growing faint from loss of blood. Finally came the fifth ball, this time striking him in the face and passing out, just missing the jugular vein. Falling, he lay unconscious with his face in his cap, into which poured the blood from his wound until it threatened to smother him. It might have done so, but for still another ball which pierced the cap and let out the blood. When Gordon was borne to the rear he had been so seriously wounded and lost so much blood that his case seemed hopeless. Fortunately for him, his faithful wife had followed him to the war and now became his nurse. As she entered the room with a look of dismay on seeing him, Gordon, who could scarcely speak from the condition of his face, sought to reassure her with the faintly articulated words, "Here's your handsome husband, been to an Irish wedding." It was providential for him that he had this faithful and devoted nurse by his side. Only her earnest and incessant care saved him to join the war again. Day and night she was beside him, and when erysipelas attacked his wounded arm, and the doctors told her to paint the arm above the wound 3 or 4 times a day with iodine, she obeyed by painting it, as he thought, 300 or 400 times a day. Under God's providence, he says, I owe my life to her incessant watchfulness night and day, and to her tender nursing through weary weeks and anxious months. End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of Historical Tales, Volume 2, American 2. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Historical Tales, Volume 2, American 2, by Charles Morris. Chapter 32. The Last Triumph of Stonewall Jackson. The story of the battle of Chancellorsville, and of Jackson's famous flank movement, with its disastrous result to Hooker's army, and to the Confederates in the loss of their beloved leader, has been often told. But these narratives are from the outside. We propose to give one here from the inside, in the graphic description of Heros von Borke, General J.E.B. Stuart's chief of staff, who took an active part in the stirring events of that critical 2nd of May, 1863. It is a matter of general history how General Hooker led his army across Rappahannock into that ugly region at Chancellorsville, with its morasses, hills, and ravines, its dense forest of scrub oaks and pines, and its square miles of tangled undergrowth, which was justly known as "the Wilderness," and how he strongly entrenched himself against an attack in front, with breastworks of logs and an abatis of felled trees. It is equally familiar how Lee, well aware of the peril of attacking those formidable works, accepted the bold plan of Stonewall Jackson, who proposed to make a secret flank movement and fall with his entire corps on Hooker's undefended rear. This was a division of Lee's army which might have led to disaster and destruction. But he had learned to trust in Jackson's star. He accordingly made vigorous demonstrations in Hooker's front, in order to attract his attention and keep him employed, while Jackson was marching swiftly and stealthily through the thick woods, with Stuart's cavalry between him and the foe, to the Orange Plank Road 4 miles westward from Chancellorsville. With this introductory sketch of the situation we leave the details of the march to von Borke. All was bustle and confusion as I galloped along the lines on the morning of the 2nd, to obtain, according to Stuart's orders, the latest instructions for our cavalry from General Lee, who was located at a distance of some miles to our right. Anderson's and McLaw's sharpshooters were advancing, and already exchanging shots with the enemy's skirmishers, the line of battle of these two divisions having been partially extended over the space previously occupied by Jackson's corps, that they might cover its movements. This splendid corps meanwhile was marching in close columns in a direction which set us all wondering what could be the intentions of old Stonewall. But as we beheld him riding along, heading the troops himself, we should as soon have thought of questioning the sagacity of our admired chief as of hesitating to follow him blindly wherever he should lead. The orders of the cavalry were to report to Jackson and to form his advance guard, and in that capacity we marched silently along through the forest, taking a small by-road, which brought us several times so near the enemy's lines that the stroke of axes, mingled with the hum of voices from their camp, was distinctly audible. Thus commenced the famous flank march, which more than any operation of the war proved the brilliant strategical talents of General Lee and the consummate ability of his lieutenant. About 2 o'clock a body of Federal cavalry came in sight, making, however, but slight show of resistance and falling back slowly before us. By about 4 o'clock we had completed our movement without encountering any material obstacle, and reached a patch of woods in rear of the enemy's right wing, formed by the 11th Corps, Howard's, which was encamped in a large open field not more than a half-mile distant. Halting here, the cavalry threw forward a body of skirmishers to occupy the enemy's attention, while the divisions of Jackson's corps, A.P. Hill's, Colston's, and Rhodes', numbering in all about 28,000 men, moved into line of battle as fast as they arrived. Ordered to reconnoitre the position of the Federals, I rode cautiously forward through the forest, and reached a point whence I obtained a capital view of the greater part of the troops, whose attitude betokened how totally remote was any suspicion that a numerous host was so near at hand. It was evident that the whole movement we had thus so successfully executed was regarded as merely an unimportant cavalry raid, for only a few squadrons were drawn up in line to oppose us, and a battery of 4 guns were placed in a position to command the plank road from Germanna, over which we had been marching for the last 2 hours. The main body of the troops were listlessly reposing, while some regiments were looking on, drawn up in dress parade. Artillery horses were quietly grazing at some distance from their guns, and the whole scene presented a picture of the most perfect heedlessness and nonchalance, compatible only with utter unconsciousness of impending danger. While complacently gazing on this extraordinary spectacle, somewhat touched myself, apparently, with the spell of listless incaution in which our antagonists were locked, I was startled with the sound of closely approaching footsteps, and turning in their direction beheld a patrol of 6 or 8 of the enemy's infantry just breaking through the bushes and gazing at me with most unmistakable astonishment. I had no time to lose here, that was certain. So quickly tugging my horse's head round in the direction of my line of retreat, and digging my spurs into his sides, I dashed off from before the bewildered Yankees, and was out of sight ere they had time to take steady aim, the bullets that came whizzing after me flying far wide of the mark. On my return to the spot where I had left Stuart, I found him, with Jackson and the officers of their respective staffs, stretched out along the grass beneath a gigantic oak, and tranquilly discussing their plans for the impending battle which both seemed confidently to regard as likely to end in a great and important victory for our arms. Towards 5 o'clock, Jackson's adjutant, Major Pendleton, galloped up to us and reported that the line of battle was formed and all was in readiness for immediate attack. Accordingly, the order was at once given for the whole corps to advance. All hastened forthwith to their appointed posts, General Stuart and his staff joining the cavalry, which was to operate on the left of our infantry. Scarcely had we got up to our men when the Confederate yell, which always preceded a charge, burst forth along our lines, and Jackson's veterans, who had been with difficulty held back till that moment, bounded forward towards the astounded and perfectly paralyzed enemy, while the thunder of our horse artillery, on whom devolved the honor of opening the ball, reached us from the other extremity of the line. The more hotly we sought to hasten to the front, the more obstinately did we get entangled in the undergrowth, while our infantry moved on so rapidly that the Federals were already completely routed by the time we had got thoroughly quit of the forest. It was a strange spectacle that now greeted us. The whole of the 11th Corps had broken at the first shock of the attack. Entire regiments had thrown down their arms, which were lying in regular lines on the ground, as if for inspection. Suppers, just prepared, had been abandoned. Tents, baggage, wagons, cannons, half-slaughtered oxen covered the foreground in chaotic confusion, while in the background a host of many thousand Yankees were discerned scampering for their lives as fast as their limbs could carry them, closely followed by our men, who were taking prisoners by the hundreds and scarcely firing a shot. That the story of panic here told is not too much colored by the writer's sympathy for his cause may be seen by the following extract from Lossing's Civil War in America, a work whose sympathies are distinctly on the other side. After saying that Jackson's march had not passed unobserved by the Federals, who looked on it as a retreat towards Richmond, and were preparing for a vigorous pursuit of the supposed fugitives, Lossing thus describes the Confederate onset and the Federal rout. He, Jackson, had crossed the Orange Plank Road, and under cover of the dense jungle of the wilderness had pushed swiftly northward to the old turnpike and beyond, feeling his enemy at every step. Then he turned his face toward Chancellorsville, and just before 6 o'clock in the evening he burst from the thickets with 25,000 men, and like a sudden, unexpected, and terrible tornado, swept on towards the flank and rear of Howard's corps, which occupied the national right. The game of the forest, deer, wild turkeys, and hares, flying wildly before him, and becoming to the startled Unionists the heralds of the approaching tempest of war. These mute messengers were followed by the sound of bugles, then by a few shots from approaching skirmishers, then by a tremendous yell from 1,000 throats and a murderous fire from a strong battle line. Jackson, in heavy force, was upon the 11th Corps at the moment when the men were preparing for supper and repose, without a suspicion of danger near. Levin's division, on the extreme right, received the first blow, and almost instantly the surprised troops, panic-stricken, fled towards the rear, along the line of the corps, communicating their emotions of alarm to the other divisions. In the wildest confusion, the fugitives rushed along the road towards Chancellorsville, upon the position of General Carl Schurz, whose division had already retreated, in anticipation of the onset, and the turbulent tide of frightened men rolled back upon General A. von Steinwehr, utterly regardless of the exertions of the commander of the corps and his subordinate officers to check their flight. Only a few regiments, less demoralized than the others, made resistance, and these were instantly scattered like chaff, leaving half their number dead or dying on the field. With this vivid picture of an army in a panic, we shall again take up von Borcke's personal narrative at the point where we left it. The broken nature of the ground was against all cavalry operations, and though we pushed forward with all our will, it was with difficulty we could keep up with Jackson's foot cavalry, as this famous infantry was often called. Meanwhile, a large part of the Federal army, roused by the firing and the alarming reports from their rear, hastened to the field of action and exerted themselves in vain to arrest the disgraceful rout of their comrades of the 11th Corps. Numerous batteries having now joined the conflict, a terrific cannonade roared along the lines, and the fury of the battle was soon at its full height. Towards dark, a sudden pause ensued in the conflict, occasioned by Jackson giving orders for his lines to reform for the continuation of the combat, the rapid and prolonged pursuit of the enemy having thrown them into considerable confusion. Old Stonewall being thoroughly impressed with the conviction that in a few hours the enemy's whole forces would be defeated, and that their principal line of retreat would be in the direction of Ely's Ford, Stuart was ordered to proceed at once towards that point with a portion of his cavalry, in order to barricade the road and as much as possible impede the retrograde movement of the enemy. In this operation we were joined by a North Carolina infantry regiment which was already on its way towards the river. Leaving the greater part of the brigade behind us under Fitz Lee's command, we took only the 1st Virginia Cavalry with us, and trotting rapidly along a small by-path overtook the infantry about 2 miles from the ford. Riding with Stuart a little ahead of our men, I suddenly discovered, on reaching the summit of a slight rise in the road, a large encampment in the valley to our right, not more than 1/4 of a mile from where we stood, and farther still, on the opposite side of the river, more camp fires were visible, indicating the presence of a large body of troops. Calling a halt, the General and I rode cautiously forward to reconnoitre the enemy a little more closely, and we managed to approach near enough to hear distinctly the voices and distinguish the figures of the men sitting around their fires or strolling through the camp. The unexpected presence of so large a body of the enemy immediately in our path entirely disconcerted our previous arrangements. Nevertheless, Stuart determined on giving them a slight surprise, and disturbing their comfort by a few volleys from our infantry. Just as the regiment, mustering about 1,000, had formed into line according to orders, and was prepared to advance on the enemy, 2 officers of General A. P. Hill's staff rode up in a great haste and excitement, and communicated something in a low tone to General Stuart, by which he seemed greatly startled and affected. "Take the command of that regiment and act on your own responsibility," were his whispered injunctions to me, as he immediately rode off, followed by the other officers and the cavalry at their topmost speed. The thunder of the cannon, which for the last hour had increased in loudness, announced that Jackson had recommenced the battle, but as to the course or actual position of affairs I had not an iota of information, and my anxiety being moreover increased by the suddenness of Stuart's departure on some unknown emergency, I felt rather awkwardly situated. Here was I in the darkness of the night, in an unknown and thickly wooded country some 6 miles from our main army, and opposite to a far superior force, whom I was expected to attack with troops whom I had never before commanded, and to whom I was scarcely known. I felt, however, that there was no alternative but blind obedience, so I advanced with the regiment to within about 50 yards of the enemy's encampment, and gave the command to fire. A hail of bullets rattled through the forest, and as volley after volley was fired, the confusion and dismay occasioned in the camp were indescribable. Soldiers and officers could be plainly seen by the light of the fires walking helplessly about, horses were galloping wildly in all directions, and the sound of bugles and drums mingled with the cries of the wounded and flying, who sought in the distant woods a shelter against the murderous fire of their unseen enemy. The troops whom we thus dispersed and put to flight consisted, as I was afterward informed, of the greater part of Averell's cavalry division, and a great number of the men of this command were so panic-stricken that they did not consider themselves safe till they had reached the opposite side of the Rapidan, when they straggled off for miles all through Culpeper County. Our firing had been kept up for about half an hour, and had by this time stirred up alarm in the camps on the other side of the river, the troops of which were marching on us from various directions. Accordingly, I gave orders to my North Carolinians to retire, leaving the task of bringing his command back to the colonel, while, anxious to rejoin Stuart as soon as I could, I galloped on ahead through the dark forest, whose solemn silence was only broken by the melancholy cry of hosts of whippoorwills. The firing had now ceased altogether, and all fighting seemed to have been entirely given up, which greatly increased my misgivings. After a tedious ride of nearly an hour over the field of battle, still covered with hundreds of wounded groaning in their agony, I at last discovered Stuart seated under a solitary plum-tree, busily writing dispatches by the dim light of a lantern. From General Stuart I now received the first intimation of the heavy calamity which had befallen us by the wounding of Jackson. After having instructed his men to fire at everything approaching from the direction of the enemy, in his eagerness to reconnoitre the position of the Federals, and entirely forgetting his own orders, he had been riding with his staff officers outside our pickets, when on their return, being mistaken for the enemy, the little party were received by a South Carolina regiment with a volley that killed or wounded nearly every man of them, and laid low our beloved Stonewall himself. The Federals advancing at the same time, a severe skirmish ensued, in the course of which one of the bearers of the litter on which the General was being carried was killed, and Jackson fell heavily to the ground, receiving soon afterward a second wound. For a few minutes, in fact, the General was in the hands of the enemy, but his men, becoming aware of his perilous position, rushed forward, and speedily driving back the advancing foe, carried their wounded commander to the rear. Jackson received 3 balls, 1 in the right hand and 2 in the left arm, one of these shattering the bone just below the shoulder and severing an artery. He was borne to the Wilderness Tavern, where a Confederate hospital had been established, and there his arm was amputated. 8 days after receiving his wounds, on the 10th of May, he died, an attack of pneumonia being the chief cause of his death. His last words were, as a smile of ineffable sweetness passed over his pale face, "Let us cross over the river and rest under the shade of the trees." Thus died the man who was justly named the right hand of General Lee, and whose death converted his last great victory into a serious disaster for the Confederate cause, the loss of a leader like Stonewall Jackson being equivalent to the destruction of an army. End of chapter 32. Chapter 33 of Historical Tales, Volume 2, American 2. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Historical Tales, Volume 2, American 2, by Charles Morris. Chapter 33 John Morgan's Famous Raid. The romance of war dwells largely upon the exploits of partisan leaders, men with a roving commission to do business on their own account, and in whose ranks are likely to gather the dare-devils of the army, those who love to come and go as they please, and leave a track of adventure and dismay behind them. There were such leaders in both armies during the Civil War, and especially in that of the South. And among the most daring and successful of them was General John H. Morgan, whose famous raid through Indiana and Ohio it is our purpose here to describe. Morgan was a son of the people, not of the aristocratic Cavalier class, but was just the man to make his mark in a conflict of this character, being richly supplied by nature with courage, daring, and self-possession in times of peril. He became a cavalry leader in the regular service, but was given a free foot to control his own movements, and had gathered about him a body of men of his own type, with whom he roamed about with a daring and audacity that made him a terror to the enemy. Morgan's most famous early exploit was his invasion of Kentucky in 1862, in which he kept the state in a fever of apprehension during most of the summer, defeating all who faced him, and venturing so near to Cincinnati that the people of that city grew wild with apprehension. Only the sharp pursuit of General G.C. Smith with a superior cavalry force saved that rich city from being made an easy prey to Morgan and his men. As preliminary to our main story, we may give in brief one of Morgan's characteristic exploits. The town of Gallatin, 20 miles north of Nashville, was occupied by a small Federal force, and seemed to Morgan to offer a fair field for one of his characteristic raids. His men were ready, they always were for an enterprise promising danger and loot, and they fell on the town with a swoop that quickly made them its masters and its garrison their captives. While the victors were paying themselves for the risk by spoiling the enemy, Morgan proceeded to the telegraph office with a hope that he might find important dispatches. So sudden had been the assault that the operator did not know that anything out of the usual had taken place, and took Morgan for a Northern officer. When asked what was going on, he replied, "Nothing particular, except that we hear a good deal about the doings of that rebel bandit Morgan. If he should happen to come across my path, I have pills enough here to satisfy him." He drew his revolver and flourished it bravely in the air. Morgan turned on the braggart with a look and tone that quite robbed him of his courage, saying, "I am Morgan. You are speaking to Morgan, you miserable wretch. Do you think you have any pills to spare for me?" The operator almost sank on his knees with terror, while the weapon fell from his nerveless hand. "Don't be scared," said the General. "I will not hurt you. But I want you to send off this dispatch at once to Prentiss." The much scared operator quickly ticked off the following message: "Mr. Prentiss, as I learn at this telegraph office that you intend to proceed to Nashville, perhaps you will allow me to escort you there at the head of my troop. John Morgan." What effect this dispatch had on Prentiss, history sayeth not. With this preliminary account of Morgan and the character of his exploits, we proceed to the most famous incident of his career, his daring invasion of the North, one of the most stirring and exciting incidents of the war. The main purpose of this invasion is said to have been to contrive a diversion in favor of General Buckner, who proposed to make a dash across Kentucky and seize Louisville, and afterward, with Morgan's aid, to capture Cincinnati. It was also intended to form a nucleus for an armed counter-revolution in the Northwest, where the Knights of the Golden Circle and the Sons of Liberty, associations in sympathy with the South, were strong. But with these ulterior purposes we have nothing here to do, our text being the incidents of the raid itself. General Morgan started on this bold adventure on June 27, 1863, with a force of several thousand mounted men, and with 4 pieces of artillery. The start was made from Sparta, Tennessee, where the swollen Cumberland was crossed in boats and canoes on the 1st and 2nd of July, the horses, with some difficulty, being made to swim. After successful encounters with Jacob's cavalry and a troop of Wolford's cavalry, the adventurers pushed on, reaching the stockade at Green River Bridge on July 4th. Here Colonel Moore was strongly entrenched with a small body of Michigan troops, and sent the following reply to Morgan's demand for a surrender: "If it was any other day I might consider the demand, but the 4th of July is a bad day to talk about surrender, and I must therefore decline." Moore proved quite capable, with the aid of his entrenchments, of hailing good his refusal, Morgan being repulsed, after a brisk engagement, with a loss of about 60 men, as estimated by Captain Cunningham, an officer of his staff. Lebanon was taken, after a severe engagement, on the 5th, yielding the Confederates a good supply of guns and ammunition, and the Ohio was reached at Brandenburg in a drenching rain on the evening of the 7th. Here 2 steamers were seized, and the whole force crossed on the next day to the Indiana shore. General Morgan's force had been swelled by recruits gained in Kentucky, until it now numbered 4,600 men, and its 4 guns had become 10. But he was being hotly pursued by General Hobson, who had hastily got on his track with a cavalry force stronger than his own. This reached the river to see the last of Morgan's men safe on the Indiana shore, and one of the steamers they had used floating a mass of flames down the stream. Hobson's loss of time in crossing the stream gave Morgan 24 hours' advance, which he diligently improved. The advance of Rosecrans against Bragg had prevented the proposed movement of Buckner to the north, and there remained for Morgan only an indefinite movement through the Northern States, with the secondary hope of finding aid and sympathy there. It was likely to be an enterprise of the utmost peril, with Hobson hotly on his track and the Home Guards rising in his front, but the dauntless Morgan did not hesitate in his desperate adventure. The first check was at Corydon, where a force of militia had gathered, but these were quickly overpowered, the town was forced to yield its quota of spoil, 300 fresh horses were seized, and Morgan adopted a shrewd system of collecting cash contributions from the well-to-do, demanding $1,000 from the owner of each mill and factory as a condition of saving their property from the flames. It may be said here that Corydon was the principal place in which any strong opposition was made by the people, the militia being concentrated at the large towns, which Morgan took care to avoid, pursuing his way through the panic-stricken villages and rural districts. There were other brushes with the Home Guards, but none of much importance. The failure of the original purpose of the movement, and the brisk pursuit of the Federal cavalry, left Morgan little to hope for but to get in safety across the Ohio again. In addition to Hobson's cavalry force, General Judah's division was in active motion to intercept him, and the whole line of the Ohio swarmed with foes. The position of the raiders grew daily more desperate, but they rode gallantly on, trusting the result to destiny and the edge of their good swords. On swept Morgan and his men, on rushed Hobson and his troopers, but the former rode on fresh horses, the latter followed on jaded steeds. For 5 miles on each side of his line of march Morgan swept the country clear of horses, leaving his own weary beasts in their stead, while Hobson's force, finding no remounts, grew steadily less in number from the exhaustion of his horses. The people, through fear, even fed and watered the horses of Morgan's men with the greatest promptness, thus adding to the celerity of his movements. Some anecdotes of the famous ride may here be fitly given. At one point on his ride through Indiana, Morgan left the line of march with 350 of his men to visit a small town, the main body marching on. Dashing into the place, he found a body of some 300 home guards, each with a good horse. They were dismounted and their horses tied to the fences. Their captain, a confiding individual, on the wrong side of 60, looked with surprise at this irruption, and asked, "Whose company is this?" "Wolford's cavalry," was the reply. "What, Kentucky boys? Glad to see you. Where's Wolford?" "There he sits," answered the man, pointing to Morgan, who was carelessly seated sideways on his horse. Walking up to Wolford, as he thought him, the Indiana captain saluted him. "Captain, how are you?" "Bully, how are you? What are you going to do with all these men and horses?" "Why, you see that horse-thieving John Morgan is in this part of the country cutting up the deuce. Between you and me, captain, if he comes this way, we'll try and give him the best we've got in the shop." "You'll find him hard to catch. We've been after him for 14 days, and can't see him at all," said Morgan. "If our hosses would only stand fire, we'd be all right." "They won't stand, eh?" "Not for shucks. I say, captain, I'd think it a favour if you and your men would put your saddles on our hosses, and give our lads a little idea of a cavalry drill. They say you're prime at that." "Why, certainly, anything to accommodate. I think we can show you some useful evolutions." Little time was lost in changing the saddles from the tired to the fresh horses, the Hoosier boys aiding in the work, and soon the Confederates, delighted with the exchange, were in their saddles and ready for the word. Morgan rode up and down the column, then moved to the front, took off his hat, and said, "All right now, captain. If you and your men will form a double line along the road and watch us, we will try to show you a movement you have never seen." The captain gave the necessary order to his men, who drew up in line. "Are you ready?" asked Morgan. "All right, Wolford." "Forward!" shouted Morgan, and the column shot ahead at a rattling pace, soon leaving nothing in sight but a cloud of dust. When the news became whispered among the astonished Hoosiers that the polite visitor was Morgan instead of Wolford, there was gnashing of teeth in that town, despite the fact that each man had been left a horse in exchange for his own. As Morgan rode on, he continued his polite method of levying a tax from the mill owners instead of burning their property. At Salem, the next place after leaving Corydon, he collected $3,000 from 3 mill owners. Capturing at another time Washington DePow, a man of large wealth, he said to him, "Sir, do you consider your flour mill worth $2,000? DePow thought it was worth that. "Very well, you can save it for that much money." DePow promptly paid the cash. "Now," said Morgan, "do you think your woolen mill worth $3,000? "Yes," said DePow, with more hesitation, "you can buy it from us for that sum." The $3,000 was paid over less willingly, and the mill owner was heartily glad that he had no other mills to redeem. Another threat to burn did not meet with as much success. Colonel Craven of Ripley, who was taken prisoner, talked in so caustic a tone that Morgan asked where the colonel lived. "At Osgood," was the answer. "That little town on the railroad?" "Yes," said the colonel. "All right, I shall send a detachment there to burn the town." "Burn and be hanged," said the colonel. "It isn't much of a town, anyhow." Morgan laughed heartily at the answer. "I like the way you talk, old fellow," he said, "and I guess your town can stand." As the ride went on, Morgan had more and more cause for alarm. Hobson was hanging like a burr on his rear, rarely more than half a day's march behind. The lack of fresh horses kept him from getting nearer. Judah was on his flank, and had many of his men patrolling the Ohio. The governors had called for troops, and the country was rising on all sides. The Ohio was now the barrier between him and safety, and Morgan rode thither at top speed, striking the river on the 19th at Buffington Ford above Pomeroy in Ohio. For the past week, as Cunningham says, every hillside contained an enemy and every ravine a blockade, and we reached the river dispirited and worn down. At the river, instead of safety, imminent peril was found. Hundreds of Judah's men were on the stream in gunboats to head him off. Hobson, Wolford, and other cavalry leaders were closing in from behind. The raiders seemed environed by the enemies, and sharp encounters began. Judah struck them heavily in flank. Hobson assailed them in the rear, and hemmed in on 3 sides, and unable to break through the environing lines, 500 of the raiders, under Dick Morgan and Ward, were forced to surrender. Seeing that the enemy had every advantage of position, says Cunningham, an overwhelming force of infantry and cavalry, and that we were becoming completely environed in the meshes of the net set for us, the command was ordered to move up the river at double quick, and we moved rapidly off the field, leaving 3 companies of dismounted men and perhaps 200 sick and wounded in the enemy's possession. Our cannon were undoubtedly captured at the river. Morgan now followed the line of the stream, keeping behind the hills out of the reach of the gunboat fire, till Bealville, 14 miles above, was reached. Here he rode to the stream, having distanced the gunboats, and with threats demanded aid from the people in crossing. Flats and scows were furnished for only about 300 of the men, who managed to cross before the gunboats appeared in sight. Others sought to cross by swimming. In this effort Cunningham had the following experience. My poor mare being too weak to carry me, turned over and commenced going down. Encumbered by clothes, sabre, and pistols, I made but poor progress in the turbid stream. But the recollections of home, of a bright-eyed maiden in the sunny south, and an inherent love of life actuated me to continue swimming. But I hear something behind me snorting. I feel it passing. Thank God, I am saved. A riderless horse dashes by, I grasp his tail, onward he bears me, and the shore is reached. And thus Cunningham passes out of the story. The remainder of the force fled inland, hotly pursued, fighting a little, burning bridges, and being at length brought to bay, surrounded by foes, and forced to surrender, except a small party with Morgan still at their head. Escape for these seemed hopeless. For 6 days more they rode onward in a desperate effort to reach the Ohio at some unguarded point. They were sharply pursued, and at length, on Sunday, July 26th, found themselves very hotly pressed. Along one road dashed Morgan at the full speed of his mounts. Over a road at right angles rushed Major Rue, thundering along. It was a sharp burst for the intersection. Morgan reached it first, and Rue thought he had escaped, but the Major knew the country like a book. His horses were fresh, and Morgan's were jaded. Another tremendous dash was made for the Beaver Creek road, and this the Major reached a little ahead. It was all up now with the famous raid. Morgan's men were too few to break through the intercepting force. He made the bluff of sending a flag with a demand to surrender, but Rue couldn't see it in that light, and a few minutes afterward Morgan rode up to him, saying, "You have beat me this time," and expressing himself as gratified that a Kentuckian was his captor. A mere fragment of the command remained, the others having been scattered and picked up at various points. And thus ended the career in capture or death of nearly all the more than 4,000 bold raiders who had crossed the Ohio 3 weeks before. They had gained Frame, but with captivity as its goal. Morgan and several of his officers were taken to Columbus, the capital of Ohio, and were there confined in felon cells in the penitentiary. 4 months afterward the leader and 6 of his captains escaped and made their way in safety to the Confederate lines. Here is the story in outline of how they got free from durance vile. 2 small knives served them for tools, with which they dug through the floors of their cells, composed of cement and 9 inches of brickwork, and in this way reached an air chamber below. They had now only to dig through the soft earth under the foundation walls of the penitentiary and open a passage into the yard. They had furnished themselves with a strong rope made of their bedclothes, and with this they scaled the walls. In some way they had procured citizens' clothes, so that those who afterward saw them had no suspicion. In the cell Morgan left the following note: Cell No. 20, November 20th, 1863. Commencement, November 4th, 1863. Conclusion, November 20th, 1863. Number of hours of labor per day, 3. Tools, 2 small knives. La patience est amère, mais son fruit est doux. Patience is bitter, but its fruit is sweet. By order of my 6 honorable confederates. Morgan and Captain Hines went immediately to the railroad station at 1 o'clock in the morning, and boarded a train going toward Cincinnati. When near this city they went to the rear car, slackened the speed by putting on the brake, and jumped off, making their way to the Ohio. Here they induced a boy to row them across, and soon found shelter with friends in Kentucky. A reward of $1,000 was offered for Morgan, alive or dead, but the news of the ovation with which he was soon after received in Richmond proved to his careless jailers that he was safely beyond their reach. A few words will finish the story of Morgan's career. He was soon at the head of a troop again, annoying the enemy immensely in Kentucky. One of his raiding parties, 300 strong, actually pushed General Hobson, his former pursuer, into a bend of the Licking River, and captured him with 1,200 well-armed men. This was Morgan's last exploit. Soon afterward, he, with a portion of his staff, were surrounded when in a house at Greenville by Union troops, and the famous Confederate leader was shot dead while seeking to escape. End of Chapter 33. Chapter 34 of Historical Tales, Volume 2, American 2. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Historical Tales, Volume 2, American 2, by Charles Morris. Chapter 34, Homecoming of General Lee and His Veterans. Sad is defeat, and more than sad was the last march of General Lee's gallant army after its 4 years of heroic struggle, as it despondently made its way along the Virginian roads westward from the capital city which it had defended so long and valiantly. It was the verdant spring tide, but the fresh green foliage had no charms for the heartbroken and starving men, whose food supplies had grown so low that they were forced to gnaw the young shoots of trees for sustenance. It is not our purpose here to tell what followed the surrounding of the fragment of an army by an overwhelming force of foes, the surrender and parole, and the dispersion of the veteran troops to the four winds, but to confine ourselves to the homeward journey of General Lee and a few of his veterans. Shortly after the surrender General Lee returned to Richmond, riding slowly from the scene on his iron-gray war-horse Traveller, which had borne him so nobly through years of battle and siege. His parting with his soldiers was pathetic, and everywhere on his road to Richmond he received tokens of admiration and respect from friend and foe. Reaching Richmond, he and his companions passed sadly through a portion of the city which exhibited a distressing scene of blackened ruins from the recent conflagration. As he passed onward he was recognized, and the people flocked to meet him, cheering and waving hats and handkerchiefs. The general, to whom this ovation could not have been agreeable, simply raised his hat in response to the greetings of the citizens, and rode on to his residence in Franklin Street. The closing of its doors upon his retiring form was the final scene in that long drama of the war of which for years he had been the central figure. He had returned to that private family life for which his soul had yearned even in the most active scenes of the war. It is our purpose here to reproduce a vivid personal account of the adventures of some of the retiring soldiers, especially as General Lee bore a part in their experiences. The narrative given is the final one of a series of incidents in the life of the private soldier related by Private Carleton McCarthy. These papers, in their day, were widely read and much admired, and an extract from them cannot fail still to be of interest. We take up the story of the brave survivors homeward bound. Early in the morning of Wednesday, the 12th of April, without the stirring drum or the bugle call of old, the camp awoke to the new life. Whether or not they had a country, these soldiers did not know. Home to many when they reached it was graves and ashes. At any rate, there must be somewhere on earth a better place than a muddy, smoky camp in a piece of scrubby pines, better company than gloomy, hungry comrades and inquisitive enemies, and something in the future more exciting, if not more hopeful, than nothing to eat, nowhere to sleep, nothing to do, and nowhere to go. The disposition to start was apparent, and the preparations were promptly begun. To roll up the old blanket and oilcloth, gather up the haversack, canteen, axe, perhaps, and a few trifles, in time of peace of no value. Eat the fragments that remained, and light a pipe, was the work of a few moments. This slight employment, coupled with the pleasant anticipations of the unknown, and therefore possibly enjoyable future, served to restore somewhat the usual light-hearted manner of soldiers, and relieve the final farewells of much of their sadness. There was even a smack of hope and cheerfulness, as the little groups sallied out into the world to combat they scarcely knew what. As we cannot follow all these groups, we will join ourselves to one, and see them home. 2 brothers in arms, whose objective point is Richmond, take the road on foot. They have nothing to eat and no money. They are bound for their home in a city which, when they last heard from it, was in flames. What they will see when they arrive there they cannot imagine, but the instinctive love of home urges them. They walk on steadily and rapidly, and are not diverted by surroundings. It does not even occur to them that their situation, surrounded on all sides by armed enemies, and walking a road crowded by them, is at all novel. They are suddenly aroused to a sense of their situation by a sharp "Halt! Show your parole!" They had struck the cordon of picket posts which surrounded the surrendered enemy. It was the first exercise of authority by the Federal army. A sergeant, accompanied by a couple of muskets, stepped into the road, with a modest air examined the paroles, and said quietly, "Pass on." This strictly military part of the operation being over, the social commenced. As the two survivors passed on, they were followed by numerous remarks, such as, "Hello, Johnny, I say, going home? Ain't you glad?" They made no reply, these wayfarers, but they thought some very emphatic remarks. From this point on to Richmond was the grand thought. Steady work it was. The road, strangely enough, considering the proximity of two armies, was quite lonesome, and not an incident of interest occurred during the day. Darkness found the two comrades still pushing on. Some time after dark a light was seen a short distance ahead, and there was a sound of revelry. On approaching, the light was seen to proceed from a large fire, built on the floor of an old and dilapidated outhouse, and surrounded by a ragged, hungry, singing, and jolly crowd of paroled prisoners of the Army of Northern Virginia, who had gotten possession of a quantity of corn meal, and were waiting for the ash cakes then in the ashes. Being liberal, they offered the newcomers some of their bread. Being hungry, they accepted and ate their first meal that day. Finding the party noisy and riotous, the comrades pushed on in the darkness after a short rest, and spent the night on the road. Thursday morning they entered the village of Buckingham Court House, and traded a small pocket mirror for a substantial breakfast. There was quite a crowd of soldiers gathered around a cellar door, trying to persuade an ex-Confederate commissary of subsistence that he might as well, in view of the fact that the army had surrendered, let them have some of the stores; and after considerable persuasion and some threats, he decided to forego the hope of keeping them for himself, and told the men to help themselves. They did so. As the two tramps were about to leave the village, and were hurrying along the high road which led through it, they saw a solitary horseman approaching from the rear. It was easy to recognize at once General Lee. He rode slowly, calmly along. As he passed an old tavern on the roadside, some ladies and children waved their handkerchiefs, smiled, and wept. The general raised his eyes to the porch on which they stood, and slowly raising his hand to his hat, lifted it slightly, and as slowly again dropped his hand to his side. The survivors did not weep, but they had strange sensations. They passed on, steering, so to speak, for Cartersville and the ferry. Before leaving the village, it was the sad duty of the survivors to stop at the humble abode of Mrs. P., and tell her of the death of her husband, who fell mortally wounded, pierced by a musket ball, near Sailor's Creek. She was also told that a companion who was by his side when he fell, but who was not able to stay with him, would come along soon and give her the particulars. That comrade came and repeated the story. In a few days the dead man reached home alive and scarcely hurt. He was originally an infantryman, recently transferred to artillery, and therefore wore a small knapsack, as infantry did. The ball struck the knapsack with a whack and knocked the man down. That was all. The night was spent in an old building near the ferry, and in the morning the ferryman cheerfully put them across the river without charge. Soon after crossing, a good, silver-plated table-spoon, bearing the monogram of one of the travellers, purchased from an aged colored woman a large chunk of ash-cake and about half a gallon of buttermilk. This old darky had lived in Richmond in her younger days. She spoke of grown men and women there as chillun what I raised. "Lord, boss, does you know Miss Sadie? Well, I nursed her, and I nursed all of her children. That I did, sah. You chillun does look hungry, that you does. Well, you's welcome to these vittles, and I'm powerful glad to get dis spoon. God bless you, honey." A big log on the roadside furnished a comfortable seat for the consumption of the before-mentioned ash-cake and milk. The feast was hardly begun when the tramp of a horse's hoofs were heard. Looking up, the survivors saw with surprise General Lee approaching. He was entirely alone, and rode slowly along. Unconscious that anyone saw him, he was yet erect, dignified, and apparently as calm and peaceful as the fields and woods around him. Having caught sight of the occupants of the log, he kept his eyes fixed on them, and as he passed, turned slightly, saluted, and said, in the most gentle manner, "Good morning, gentlemen. Taking your breakfast?" The soldiers had only time to rise, salute, and say, "Yes, sir," and he was gone. It seems that General Lee pursued the road which the survivors chose, and starting later than they, overtook them, he being mounted and they on foot. At any rate, It was their good fortune to see him 3 times on the road from Appomattox to Richmond. The incidents introducing General Lee are peculiarly interesting, and the reader may rest assured of the truthfulness of the narration as to what occurred and what was said and done. After the feast of bread and milk the no longer hungry men passed on. About the time when men who have eaten a hearty breakfast become again hungry, as good fortune would have it happen, they reached a house pleasantly situated, and a comfortable place withal. Approaching the house, they were met by an exceedingly kind, energetic, and hospitable woman. She promptly asked, "You are not deserters?" "No," said the soldiers, "we have our paroles. We are from Richmond. We are homeward bound, and called to ask if you could spare us a dinner." "Spare you a dinner? Certainly I can. My husband is a miller. His mill is right across the road there, down the hill, and I have been cooking all day for the poor starving men. Take a seat on the porch there, and I will get you something to eat." By the time the travellers were seated, this admirable woman was in the kitchen at work. The pat-a-pat, pat-pat, pat, pat-a-pat, pat of the sifter, and the cracking and fizzing of the fat bacon as it fried, saluted their hungry ears, and the delicious smell tickled their olfactory nerves most delightfully. Sitting thus, entertained by delightful sounds, breathing the air, and wrapped in meditation, or anticipation rather, the soldiers saw the dust rise in the air, and heard the sound of an approaching party. Several horsemen rode up to the road gate, threw their bridles over the posts, or tied them to the overhanging boughs, and dismounted. They were evidently officers, well dressed, fine looking men, and about to enter the gate. Almost at once the man on the porch recognized General Lee and his son. They were accompanied by other officers. An ambulance had arrived at the gate also. Without delay they entered and approached the house, General Lee preceding the others. Satisfied that it was the general's intention to enter the house, the 2 brave survivors, instinctively and respectfully venerating the approaching man, determined to give him and his companions the porch. As they were executing a rather rapid and undignified flank movement to gain the right and rear of the house, the voice of General Lee overhauled them thus: "Where are you men going?" "This lady has offered to give us a dinner, and we are waiting for it," replied the soldiers. "Well, you had better move on now. This gentleman will have quite a large party on him to-day," said the general. The soldiers touched their caps, said, "Yes, sir," and retired, somewhat hurt, to a strong position on a hen coop in the rear of the house. The party then settled on the porch. The general had, of course, no authority, and the surrender of the porch was purely respectful. Knowing this, the soldiers were at first hurt, but a moment's reflection satisfied them that the general was right. He, no doubt, had suspicions of plunder, and these were increased by the movement of the men to the rear as he approached. He misinterpreted their conduct. The lady of the house, a reward for her name, hearing the dialogue in the yard, pushed her head through the crack of the kitchen door, and as she tossed a lump of dough from hand to hand, and gazed eagerly out, addressed the soldiers. "Ain't that old General Lee?" "Yes, General Lee and his son and other officers come to dine with you," they replied. "Well," she said, "he ain't no better than the men that fought for him, and I don't reckon he's as hungry, so you just come in here. I'm going to give you yours first, then I'll get something for him." What a meal it was! Seated at the kitchen table, the large-hearted woman bustling about and talking away, the ravenous tramps attacked a pile of old Virginia hoe cake and corn dodger, a frying pan with an inch of gravy and slices of bacon, streak of lean and streak of fat, very numerous. To finish, as much rich buttermilk as the drinkers could contain. With many heartfelt thanks, the survivors bade farewell to this immortal woman, and leaving the general and his party in the quiet possession of the front porch, pursued their way. Night found the survivors at the gate of a quiet, handsome, framed country residence. The weather was threatening, and it was desirable to have shelter as well as rest. Entering and knocking at the door, they were met by a servant girl. She was sent to her mistress with a request for permission to sleep on her premises. The servant returned, saying, "Missus says she is a widder, and there ain't no gentleman in the house, and she can't let you come in." She was sent with a second message, which informed the lady that the visitors were from Richmond, members of a certain company from there, and would be content with permission to sleep on the porch, in the stable, or in the barn. They would protect her property, etc., etc., etc. This message brought the lady of the house to the door. She said, "If you are members of the—— you must know my nephew, he was in that company." Of course they knew him, old chum, comrade, particular friend, splendid fellow, hope he was well when you heard from him, glad to meet you, madam. These and similar hearty expressions brought the longed-for "Come in, gentlemen, you are welcome. I will see that supper is prepared for you at once." Invitation accepted. The old haversacks were deposited in a corner under the steps, and their owners conducted downstairs to a spacious dining-room, quite prettily furnished. A large table occupied the centre of the room, and at one side there was a handsome display of silver in a glass front case. A good big fire lighted the room. The lady sat quietly working at some woman's work, and from time to time questioning in a rather suspicious manner her guests. Their direct answers satisfied her, and their respectful manner reassured her, so that by the time supper was brought in she was chatting and laughing with her defenders. The supper came in steaming hot. It was abundant, well prepared, and served elegantly. Splendid coffee, hot biscuit, luscious butter, fried ham, eggs, fresh milk. The writer could not expect to be believed if he should tell the quantity eaten at that meal. The good lady of the house enjoyed the sight, she relished every mouthful, and no doubt realized then and there the blessing which is conferred on hospitality, and the truth of that saying of old, "It is more blessed to give than to receive." The wayfarers were finally shown to a neat little chamber. The bed was soft and glistening white, too white and clean to be soiled by the occupancy of two Confederate soldiers who had not had a change of underclothing for many weeks. They looked at it, felt of it, and then spread their old blankets on the neat carpet and slept there till near the break of day. While it was yet dark, the travellers, unwilling to lose time waiting for breakfast, crept out of the house, leaving their thanks for their kind hostess, and passed rapidly on to Manikin Town, on the James River and Kanawha Canal, half a day's march from Richmond, where they arrived while it was yet early morning. The greensward between the canal and river was inviting, and the survivors laid there a while to rest and determine whether or not they would push on to the city. They desired to do so as soon as they could find a breakfast to fit them for the day's march. In this venture they met with a new experience. The party applied to a well-fed, hearty man, gruffly repulsing them, and complaining that some scoundrels had stolen his best horse the night before. He finally invited them in and set before them the bony remnants of some fish he had had for breakfast. Rising indignantly from the table, the veterans told their inhospitable host that they were not dogs, and would consider it an insult to the canine race to call him one. Apparently fearing that the story of his behaviour to old soldiers would be spread to his discredit, he now apologized for the mistake, and offered to have a breakfast cooked for them, but they were past being mollified, and left him with the most uncomplimentary epithets at the command of two old soldiers of 4 years' service. At 11 a.m. of the same day, two footsore, despondent, and penniless men stood facing the ruins of the home of a comrade who had sent a message to his mother, "Tell mother I am coming." The ruins yet smoked. A relative of the lady whose home was in ashes, and whose son said, "I am coming," stood by the survivors. "Well, then," he said, "it must be true that General Lee has surrendered." The solemnity of the remark, coupled with the certainty in the minds of the survivors, was almost amusing. The relative pointed out the temporary residence of the mother, and thither the survivors wended their way. A knock at the door startled the mother, and with agony in her eyes she appeared at the open door, exclaiming, "My poor boys!" "Are safe and coming home," said the survivors. "Thank God!" said the mother, and the tears flowed down her cheeks. A rapid walk through ruined and smoking streets, some narrow escapes of negro soldiers on police duty, the satisfaction of seeing two of the boys in blue hung up by their thumbs for pillaging, a few handshakings, and the survivors found their way to the house of a relative, where they did eat bread with thanks. A friend informed the survivors that day that farm hands were needed all around the city. They made a note of that and the name of one farmer. Saturday night the old blankets were spread on the parlour floor. Sunday morning, the 16th of April, they bade farewell to the household and started for the farmer's house. As they were about to start away, the head of the family took from his pocket a handful of odd silver pieces, and extending them to his guests, told them it was all he had, but they were welcome to half of it. Remembering that he had a wife and 3 or 4 children to feed, the soldiers smiled through their tears at his, bade him keep it all, and weep for himself rather than for them. So saying, they departed, and at sundown were at the farmer's house, 14 miles away. Monday morning, the 17th, they beat their swords, muskets in this case, into ploughshares, and did the first day's work of the 60 which the simple farmer secured at a cost to himself of about half rations for 2 men. Behold the gratitude of a people! Where grow now the shrubs which of old bore leaves and twigs for garlands? The brave live, are the fair dead? Shall time or calamity, downfall or ruin, annihilate sacrifice, or hatch an ingrate brood? End of Chapter 34. End of Historical Tales, Volume 2, American 2, by Charles Morris.